Imagine a person who has spent 3 weeks learning to play guitar, confidently asserting they understand music theory better than their experienced instructor who has dedicated 20 years to the craft. Or consider the amateur investor who makes a few profitable trades and becomes convinced they have mastered the stock market despite lacking fundamental knowledge of economics and risk management. These are not isolated incidents of arrogance, but rather manifestations of a deeply rooted cognitive phenomenon where individuals with limited knowledge or competence in a particular domain vastly overestimate their own understanding and ability. The person teaching themselves coding through a weekend crash course genuinely believes they are ready to lead a software development team. The self-proclaimed nutrition expert who read 3 internet articles thinks they understand human physiology better than registered dietitians with advanced degrees. And the casual reader of one psychology book becomes certain they can diagnose mental conditions in their friends and family members. The mechanism underlying this bias is elegantly straightforward, yet profoundly counterintuitive. The very skills required to recognize incompetence are the same skills necessary to become competent in that domain. When someone possesses only surface-level understanding of a subject, they lack the cognitive framework to comprehend the depths of what they do not know, creating a curious paradox where ignorance simultaneously prevents recognition of its own existence. As individuals accumulate genuine knowledge and expertise, they begin to encounter the vast landscape of complexity, nuance, and uncertainty that characterizes true understanding, which causes experienced practitioners to become increasingly humble about the limitations of their knowledge rather than more boastful. Yet this bias persists and even seems to accelerate in our modern era despite the democratization of information and unprecedented access to expert knowledge, possibly because the same tools that provide genuine learning opportunities also provide the illusion of expertise, where someone can consume curated content and mistake passive consumption for active mastery. The algorithms that recommend increasingly advanced content create a false sense of progression, while social media platforms reward confident proclamation over cautious expertise, incentivizing individuals to present themselves as authorities even when their knowledge remains superficial. Understanding this effect requires recognizing it not as a character flaw, but as an inevitable consequence of how human cognition processes incomplete information. A humbling realization that suggests we would all benefit from maintaining intellectual humility about the domains in which we dabble. Imagine you have formed a belief about something, perhaps about a political figure, a health remedy, or the reliability of a particular brand, and now you move through the world with this belief firmly established in your mind. What happens next is that your brain, operating with remarkable efficiency, begins to selectively filter the information that reaches your conscious awareness. You notice articles that support your belief and read them carefully, absorbing every detail that confirms what you already know to be true. You encounter contradictory evidence, perhaps in a news story or conversation, yet your mind processes this information differently, scrutinizing it for flaws, questioning its methodology, or dismissing it as an outlier or exception. Over time, this selective attention creates a powerful reinforcement loop, where the world around you seems to increasingly validate your original belief, not because the world has changed, but because you have unconsciously curated your perception of it. This mechanism operates through a deeply rooted cognitive process where your brain prioritizes information that aligns with existing beliefs, because such information feels coherent and requires less mental effort to process and integrate. When you encounter data that contradicts what you believe, your brain must work harder to reconcile the conflict, and so it often opts instead to dismiss, reinterpret, or simply overlook the contradictory evidence entirely. The remarkable aspect of confirmation bias is that it persists even among highly educated individuals, scientists, and critical thinkers who are intellectually aware that such a bias exists. Even when people are explicitly told about confirmation bias and its effects, they continue to fall prey to it, seemingly unable to counteract its influence through reason alone. We have normalized this bias so thoroughly into human cognition that we rarely recognize it operating within our own minds, instead attributing our beliefs to objective observation and logical reasoning, rather than acknowledging the invisible hand that selectively shaped what we chose to observe and how we chose to interpret it. The insidiousness of confirmation bias lies in this very invisibility. We feel certain and rational in our conclusions precisely because we cannot perceive the filtering process occurring beneath conscious awareness. To combat it requires not merely intellectual acknowledgement, but deliberate exposure to opposing viewpoints, sustained discomfort with ambiguity, and a humbling acceptance that our most firmly held convictions may be partially constructed by our own cognitive architecture rather than discovered through objective reality. This means asking ourselves uncomfortable questions. What evidence would actually change my mind? What am I not looking for because I've already decided what is true? These questions, though difficult to sit with, offer a pathway toward a more honest reckoning with our own beliefs and the forces that shape them. Imagine sitting at home on a quiet evening, scrolling through news about a major market crash or a sports team's unexpected loss, and you find yourself thinking with absolute certainty that you saw it coming all along, that the signs were so obvious that anyone could have predicted this outcome. Yet when you examine your own past thoughts and statements, you realize you held no such prediction before the event occurred. And this peculiar gap between what you remember believing and what you actually believed represents one of the most pervasive distortions of human memory and judgment. This phenomenon, known as hindsight bias or the I knew it all along effect, occurs because once we learn the outcome of an event, our minds unconsciously reconstruct our prior beliefs to align with that new knowledge, creating a false sense of inevitability and predictability that never actually existed in our minds before. When you know how a movie ends, you begin to see clues and foreshadowing throughout the earlier scenes that you genuinely did not consciously notice during your first viewing, yet your brain integrates this new information backward in time, fundamentally altering your memory of your original experience and your assessment of how obvious the ending truly was. The mechanism underlying this bias operates at a deeply automatic level within our cognitive architecture, as our brains are constantly working to maintain a coherent narrative about ourselves and our understanding of the world, and when new information arrives that contradicts our sense of coherence, rather than admitting confusion or error, our minds simply rewrite history to make ourselves appear more knowledgeable and insightful than we actually were. This rewriting happens not through deliberate dishonesty, but through genuine memory reconstruction, where the neural pathways that store our memories become intertwined with the powerful new information we have just acquired, making it nearly impossible to separate what we knew then from what we know now. We persist in this bias despite having every logical reason to recognize it and combat it, because acknowledging the true randomness and unpredictability of complex events would undermine our fundamental sense of control and competence. And so instead we convince ourselves that outcomes were inevitable and that we possessed greater foresight than we actually did, allowing us to maintain the comforting illusion that the world operates according to patterns we can discern and master. This illusion becomes particularly consequential in high-stakes domains like medicine, law, and business, where hindsight bias can lead juries to convict defendants based on outcomes rather than actual culpability, or cause organizations to scapegoat leaders for unforeseeable market shifts, transforming the inherent uncertainty of decision-making into a false narrative of obvious mistakes that should have been prevented. Imagine walking into a clothing store and seeing a jacket marked down from $299 to $149, and suddenly that price feels like an extraordinary bargain, even though you had no prior knowledge of what that jacket should actually cost, and you might never have considered purchasing it at all if the original price tag simply did not exist. This is the anchoring effect in its most fundamental form, a cognitive bias so pervasive that it shapes nearly every financial decision we make, from negotiating salaries to purchasing homes to evaluating whether a product represents genuine value. The first number we encounter, whether it is arbitrary or carefully chosen by a marketer, becomes a reference point that disproportionately influences our judgment, acting like an invisible anchor that holds our perception hostage and prevents us from floating freely toward a truly objective evaluation. When a real estate agent shows you a property listed at $600,000 before revealing it is actually priced at $520,000, your mind has already adjusted its expectations, and your sense of what constitutes a fair price has been fundamentally altered by that initial figure. The mechanism underlying this bias operates through a process called insufficient adjustment, wherein our brains use the first number we encounter as a starting point, and then fail to move far enough away from it when making adjustments based on new information, leaving us stranded somewhere between the anchor and a more rational assessment. We possess all the logical tools necessary to recognize that the original price tag tells us nothing meaningful about actual value, that market prices fluctuate based on supply and demand rather than being absolute truths, and that anchors are often deliberately planted by those seeking to influence our behavior. Yet we continue to experience powerful gravitational pulls toward these initial figures despite our awareness of the bias itself. The anchoring effect persists because our minds operate under cognitive constraints that make processing every decision with complete rationality an impossible task. So we rely on mental shortcuts and heuristics that usually serve us reasonably well. But in the case of anchors, these shortcuts lead us systematically astray, and we have normalized this manipulation so thoroughly in commercial and social contexts that we rarely question the legitimacy of the reference points we are given. Accepting them as natural features of the landscape, rather than recognizing them as tools deliberately designed to reshape our perception of reality. The insidious nature of anchoring lies in its invisibility. We cannot simply choose to ignore an anchor once it has been presented to us, much like we cannot unsee an optical illusion even after understanding how it deceives our eyes, which means that defending ourselves against this bias requires not willpower, but rather awareness and deliberate skepticism toward the first figure we encounter in any negotiation or commercial interaction. Imagine you have just watched a news report about a plane crash that killed 200 people, and for the next week, every time you board an aircraft, you feel a surge of anxiety and dread, even though statistically you are far more likely to die in a car accident on the way to the airport than you are to perish in that plane. This phenomenon is the availability heuristic at work, a cognitive shortcut where your brain judges the probability or frequency of an event based not on actual statistical likelihood, but rather on how easily examples of that event come to mind. When something is vivid, recent, or emotionally striking, your mind treats it as though it must be common or dangerous, because the memory of it is so readily available in your consciousness. The availability heuristic emerged as an evolutionary adaptation when human beings lived in small groups where personal experience and immediate observation were the most reliable sources of information. And in that ancestral context, if everyone around you was talking about a particular threat, it probably was worth worrying about. Your brain developed this mental shortcut to make rapid decisions without needing to gather comprehensive data, because in survival situations, waiting for perfect information could be fatal. However, in our modern world where news travels instantaneously and emotionally charged stories are amplified by algorithms designed to capture attention, this same mechanism becomes a liability. You overestimate the frequency of murders because murder cases receive extensive media coverage, while the thousands of people who die from preventable medical conditions receive far less dramatic attention. You become convinced that your city is unsafe because you remember the headlines about crime more vividly than the statistics showing crime has actually decreased over the past decade. The availability heuristic persists because it is deeply wired into the architecture of human cognition, and our brains continue to rely on this shortcut even when we consciously understand its flaws and limitations. We know intellectually that vivid examples are not reliable indicators of true probability, yet we cannot simply turn off this tendency through force of will alone. The bias remains stubbornly present in our decision-making processes, influencing everything from how we assess health risks to which investments we choose to make with our money. What makes this bias particularly insidious is that awareness of the availability heuristic does not automatically immunize us against it. Knowing that a vivid news story about a celebrity's health scare might distort your perception of disease risk does little to prevent that same story from influencing your medical decisions when you are in a vulnerable moment. The availability heuristic ultimately reveals how our minds prioritize the memorable over the accurate, and understanding this gap between vividness and reality may be the first step toward making more rational choices. Imagine walking into a coffee shop and noticing a barista with striking physical attractiveness, someone whose appearance immediately captures your attention. When this person hands you your coffee and smiles warmly, you might find yourself believing that the drink tastes better than it actually does, or that the service was exceptional when they simply followed standard procedures. You might even assume this person is more intelligent, more trustworthy, or more competent in their role than you would have assumed about someone with a less conventionally attractive appearance serving the identical beverage. This phenomenon is the halo effect, one of the most pervasive and influential biases shaping how we perceive and judge the world around us. The halo effect occurs when our overall positive impression of a person, typically based on one or two prominent characteristics, influences how we evaluate their other unrelated qualities and behaviors. When we perceive someone as attractive, charismatic, successful, or otherwise impressive in some domain, we unconsciously allow that single positive trait to cast a luminous glow over our entire perception of that individual, coloring every interaction and judgment we make about them. This mental shortcut evolved because our ancestors often needed to make rapid decisions about other people with limited information, and using readily observable characteristics as proxies for overall quality was sometimes a useful strategy for survival. However, in modern contexts, this shortcut frequently leads us astray. The mechanism behind the halo effect is surprisingly simple yet profoundly consequential. Our brains are pattern-matching machines constantly searching for ways to reduce cognitive load and make quick sense of complex social information. When we encounter someone who excels in one visible dimension, we retroactively and unconsciously infer that they likely excel in other dimensions as well, even when no logical connection exists between these traits. A person who is physically attractive is not necessarily more honest, intelligent, or skilled at their job, yet we persistently and unconsciously treat them as though they possess these qualities. Similarly, a successful businessperson might be assumed to be a good parent, a reliable friend, or an ethical person, when success in professional domains tells us nothing definitive about their character in other areas. What makes the halo effect particularly insidious is how normalized and invisible it has become in our society. We encounter the influence of this bias everywhere, in hiring decisions where attractive candidates receive callbacks at higher rates despite identical qualifications, in dating contexts where we overlook red flags in people we find attractive, and in entertainment and politics where charismatic figures gain followers regardless of the substantive merit of their ideas. Despite having decades of scientific evidence demonstrating how arbitrary and logically indefensible this bias truly is, we continue to operate under its influence almost unconsciously, as though the glow from one positive quality genuinely illuminates all other qualities as well. Consider the experience of scrolling through your social media feed on an ordinary evening, where you encounter dozens of posts from friends and acquaintances sharing moments from their lives. And among them is one mildly critical comment directed at something you said days ago, something you had nearly forgotten about. Yet this single negative remark immediately captures your attention and holds it with an intensity that far exceeds the pleasant photographs and celebrations surrounding it. Consuming your thoughts as you replay the interaction in your mind, analyzing every word and inferring hidden meanings that may not have existed at all, while the positive content seems to dissolve into the background almost instantly despite outnumbering the criticism by a factor of 10 or more. This is negativity bias at work, a fundamental tendency of the human mind to give greater psychological weight to negative experiences, feedback, and information than to positive or neutral ones. A weighting that persists regardless of how objectively minor the negative stimulus may be compared to the abundance of positive alternatives available in the same moment. The mechanism underlying this bias emerges from our evolutionary ancestry, when our ancestors existed in environments where threats and dangers demanded immediate attention and heightened response to ensure survival, where noticing a predator in the grass held far greater consequences than noticing a particularly nutritious berry, and where negative events typically carried more immediate implications for life and death than positive ones did. Gradually shaping our nervous systems to prioritize threat detection and negative information processing as a default mode of operation. This ancient survival mechanism has remained deeply embedded in our neurological architecture even as our modern environment has transformed completely, evolving into a threat landscape dominated not by physical predators but by social embarrassments, professional setbacks, and critical remarks. Yet our brains continue to treat these psychological threats with the same urgent alarm they reserved for survival itself. What becomes particularly remarkable is how thoroughly this bias has persisted despite our explicit awareness of its existence, and its profound misalignment with the actual structure of most people's lives, where positive experiences vastly outnumber negative ones, yet the negative ones seem to define our emotional reality and determine our sense of how things are actually going, almost as though our minds have decided that one bad thing truly does outweigh 20 good things. And we have collectively normalized this distortion so thoroughly that we rarely question whether this way of weighing experiences actually serves us anymore or merely anchors us to an outdated survival mechanism that now works against our well-being rather than for it. Imagine you've paid $50 for a concert ticket months in advance, and now the night has arrived, but you're exhausted, unwell, and genuinely don't want to go, yet you find yourself getting ready anyway, telling yourself that you can't waste the money you've already spent. Or consider the person who continues pouring thousands of dollars into a failing business, a relationship that brings them pain, or an educational program they no longer believe in, all because they've already invested so much time, effort, and money that the thought of stopping feels like admitting defeat or throwing away everything they've committed thus far. This is the sunk cost fallacy in action, and it operates with a peculiar kind of logic that our minds find deeply compelling. The mechanism is rooted in how we process loss and investment. When we have already spent a resource, whether money, time, or emotional energy, our minds become extraordinarily reluctant to view that expenditure as truly gone. Instead, we treat it as leverage, as though continuing down the same path might somehow recover or justify what we've already lost. Rationally, the money spent on that concert ticket is gone regardless of whether you attend, and the past investment in a failing business has no bearing on whether future investments will prove profitable, yet our psychological architecture resists this logic with surprising force. We've been culturally conditioned to see waste as a moral failing, to view persistence as a virtue, and to interpret abandonment of a course as weakness rather than wisdom. This normalization runs so deep that we rarely question it when we're making these decisions in real time. We tell ourselves that we're being responsible, that we're honoring our commitments, that we're not the kind of person who gives up, when in fact we're simply allowing past decisions to dictate present choices in ways that actively harm our well-being and future prospects. The fallacy persists because admitting it would require acknowledging that some of our past choices were mistakes, and that realization feels psychologically uncomfortable in ways that continued suffering sometimes does not. Yet paradoxically, the discomfort of facing a mistake is temporary, while the cost of continuing to honor a failed investment compounds indefinitely, turning a single poor decision into a pattern of self-imposed suffering that we mistake for integrity. The person who stays in an unfulfilling career for 2 more decades because they've already invested 20 years, or who remains in a harmful relationship because leaving would mean acknowledging wasted years, is not honoring those past sacrifices. They are compounding them, multiplying the loss by continuing to extract value from a depleted source. Freedom in this sense begins not with optimizing future returns, but with the courage to let the past be what it was, gone, but no longer capable of governing what comes next. The moment you accept that a past investment is truly lost is the moment you reclaim the ability to choose based on what actually serves you now, rather than what you feel obligated to justify, and in that acceptance lies the foundation of genuine wisdom. Imagine a crowded street in the middle of the afternoon where someone collapses on the sidewalk, their body suddenly going limp as passers-by continue walking around them without stopping, without calling for help, without even pausing to acknowledge that something significant has just occurred in their immediate vicinity. This scenario has played out countless times throughout history, most notably in the tragic case of Kitty Genovese in 1964, when dozens of witnesses heard her cries for help but none intervened, and many did not even bother to contact the police. The phenomenon at work here is called the Bystander Effect, a psychological tendency where individuals are less likely to offer assistance to someone in distress when other people are present. The mechanism underlying this bias operates through several interconnected pathways within our social and cognitive architecture. When we find ourselves surrounded by other observers, our sense of individual responsibility becomes diffused across the entire group, creating a psychological distribution of accountability where we unconsciously assume that someone else will take action, someone else will step forward, someone else will bear the burden of intervention. Additionally, we engage in what researchers call pluralistic ignorance, whereby we look to others for cues about how we should behave, and if those around us appear calm or indifferent, we interpret this observed passivity as social evidence that the situation may not be as serious as it initially appeared, or perhaps even that intervention is unnecessary or socially inappropriate. There is also an element of evaluation apprehension, where we fear being judged by the crowd if we act, fear appearing foolish if we misinterpret the situation, fear drawing negative attention to ourselves by stepping outside the invisible social norms that govern public behavior. What remains striking about this bias is how it persists despite being logically indefensible, despite the fact that most people report valuing human life and claiming they would help if they witnessed an emergency. Yet the presence of others systematically undermines this stated commitment to compassion and action. We have somehow normalized a social environment where collective passivity breeds individual inaction, where the presence of potential helpers actually reduces the probability of help being offered, creating a perverse system where safety in numbers translates paradoxically into danger for those in need. Understanding this paradox becomes even more critical in our modern era, where digital technologies have created new forms of bystander effect. Situations where thousands of people witness harmful content online yet remain passive observers, their collective silence enabling abuse that might be stopped by even a single intervention. Suggesting that the mechanisms of diffused responsibility have only grown more powerful as our audiences have expanded beyond the physical spaces where Kitty Genovese's neighbors once stood in silence. Imagine you are sitting in traffic, and the car in front of you suddenly cuts you off without signaling, forcing you to brake hard and your heart to race with frustration and anger. In that moment, your mind immediately concludes that the driver is reckless, inconsiderate, perhaps even dangerous, and you might silently judge them as a careless person who does not belong on the road. You have made a judgment about their character based on a single action, attributing their behavior to their personality traits and dispositional qualities. However, what you do not know, and what your brain is actively refusing to consider, is that this driver might be rushing to the hospital because a family member is experiencing a medical emergency, or they might be distracted by devastating news they just received, or their mirrors might be faulty and they genuinely did not see your vehicle. The fundamental attribution error is the tendency we all share to overestimate the role of internal characteristics, personality traits, and dispositional factors when explaining another person's behavior, while simultaneously underestimating the powerful influence of situational and environmental factors that might actually be driving that behavior. We do this constantly, in ways both small and large, assuming that people's actions reveal their true nature rather than considering the circumstances they are navigating. When someone is late to a meeting, we assume they are irresponsible rather than imagining they might have faced unexpected obstacles. When a colleague snaps at us, we believe they are hostile rather than considering they might be overwhelmed with stress we cannot see. When a stranger does not hold the door, we decide they are rude rather than acknowledging they might be lost in their own crisis. This bias persists so powerfully because our brains are inherently drawn toward simplicity and toward narrative. Creating a story about who someone is feels more satisfying and requires less cognitive effort than investigating all the invisible pressures and constraints that might be shaping their moment-by-moment choices. We seem almost designed to believe that behavior reveals character, perhaps because for most of human history, we lived in small communities where people's repeated actions did genuinely reflect their values. Yet modern life is vastly more complex, filled with situational pressures we cannot easily perceive, yet we continue applying this ancient shortcut to every encounter, every glance, every action, confidently misjudging the inner lives of those around us. The tragedy of this error is that it closes us off from compassion. We construct a rigid identity around a single moment and then defend that construction fiercely, missing opportunities to extend grace or to understand the fragile, complicated human beings we encounter every day. In recognizing this bias, we open a door to a quieter, more generous way of moving through the world, one where we pause before judging and ask ourselves what invisible pressures might be shaping the person before us. Consider a moment when you received critical feedback at work, perhaps from a manager or colleague who pointed out a mistake in a project you had invested considerable time and effort into completing. Your immediate internal response likely involved a series of explanations that shifted responsibility away from your own abilities or intentions. You might have told yourself that the deadline was unreasonable, that you were given incomplete information, that you were dealing with personal stress at the time, or that your colleague simply did not understand the full context of your decision-making process. Yet when you observe the same mistake made by someone else, your interpretation shifts dramatically. You are far more likely to attribute their error directly to their incompetence, lack of attention to detail, or poor judgment, rarely considering the external circumstances that may have constrained their performance. This is self-serving bias, the remarkable human tendency to attribute our successes to internal factors like our intelligence, skill, and effort, while attributing our failures to external factors like bad luck, unfair circumstances, or the actions of others. Simultaneously, we reverse this pattern when observing other people, crediting their successes to luck or easy circumstances while blaming their failures on their personal shortcomings and character flaws. The mechanism underlying this bias is rooted in our fundamental need to maintain a positive self-image and protect our self-esteem from the threatening implications of failure. When we experience failure or criticism, acknowledging that the failure resulted from our own limitations creates genuine psychological distress, so our minds automatically generate alternative explanations that preserve our sense of competence and worth. This is not a conscious or deliberate deception, but rather an unconscious filtering process that shapes how we interpret and remember events. The asymmetry in how we judge ourselves versus others serves a protective function, yet it also distorts our perception of reality in ways that prevent genuine self-understanding and growth, leaving us convinced of our own reasonableness while remaining blind to the patterns that might actually limit our effectiveness and potential. When you fail to recognize this pattern operating within yourself, you miss opportunities to learn from genuine mistakes, to develop genuine humility, and to build the kind of self-awareness that allows for meaningful improvement and stronger relationships built on honesty rather than defensiveness. The colleague who made the same mistake you did is likely engaging in the identical self-protective reasoning, convinced of their own justification while remaining equally blind to their contribution to the problem, creating a mutual hall of mirrors where two reasonable people locked in conflict cannot see how their shared bias is preventing resolution and understanding. Breaking free from this pattern requires the deliberate practice of examining your own failures with the same critical eye you naturally turn toward others, asking not what circumstances prevented me from succeeding. Consider the moment when someone decides to start a new business venture, fully convinced that while most startups fail, theirs will undoubtedly succeed. Or when a person begins a new relationship believing that their partnership will be the exception to the patterns of heartbreak they have witnessed in others around them. Or when a student approaches a difficult exam with the unshakable certainty that they will perform better than their previous test scores suggest is realistic. This is optimism bias in its most fundamental expression, a cognitive tendency through which individuals systematically overestimate the likelihood that positive events will happen to them, while simultaneously underestimating the probability that negative events will occur in their own lives. The mechanism underlying this bias operates through a filtering process in how we construct our personal narratives and assess our circumstances. When we contemplate future outcomes, our brains selectively emphasize evidence that supports a positive conclusion while minimizing or discounting information that would suggest a more sobering reality. We convince ourselves that we possess unique qualities, special skills, or exceptional circumstances that distinguish us from the general population and protect us from the ordinary risks that affect everyone else. This process feels entirely reasonable from the inside because we genuinely believe we can perceive genuine differences between ourselves and statistical averages, when in fact we are simply engaging in motivated reasoning that serves our emotional needs rather than our rational assessment of probability. What makes optimism bias particularly persistent and deeply woven into the fabric of how we navigate existence is that it provides genuine psychological benefits in the moment, delivering a sense of hope, motivation, and resilience that can actually improve our performance in challenging situations. The person who believes they will succeed often works harder, persists longer, and remains more creative in problem-solving than someone burdened by accurate pessimism, which creates a strange paradox where a false belief occasionally produces real positive outcomes that reinforce the bias itself. Yet this same mechanism that occasionally catalyzes genuine success also leaves us vulnerable to catastrophic misjudgments. The entrepreneur who ignored warning signs in their business plan, the investor who dismissed risk assessments, the individual who delayed seeking medical attention because they were certain their symptoms would resolve on their own. Optimism bias thus reveals itself as neither purely beneficial nor purely destructive, but rather as a cognitive pattern that demands wisdom in knowing when to trust our hopeful instincts and when to deliberately override them with disciplined realism. The challenge lies in recognizing that optimism bias is not a flaw to be eliminated, but a force to be calibrated. We might cultivate what psychologists call realistic optimism, where we maintain hope and motivation while simultaneously building safeguards through planning, seeking outside perspectives, and regularly stress testing our assumptions against contrary evidence. Consider the subtle warmth you feel when someone mentions they attended your university, or the immediate sense of kinship when you meet someone from your hometown, or the quiet pride that swells in your chest when your country's athletes compete on the world stage. These moments reveal something profound about human psychology, something so deeply woven into our social fabric that we rarely pause to examine it. In-group bias is the tendency to favor, trust, and attribute positive qualities to people we perceive as members of our own group, while simultaneously viewing members of other groups with skepticism, suspicion, or outright negativity. This bias operates across countless dimensions of identity, whether based on nationality, religion, profession, sports allegiance, political affiliation, or even arbitrary categories invented moments before in a laboratory experiment. The mechanism driving this bias appears to be rooted in our evolutionary past, when belonging to a cohesive group meant survival and resources, when the members of your tribe were your primary allies against an uncertain and dangerous world. Our brains developed systems that incentivized loyalty to the in-group and wariness toward the out-group as a matter of practical necessity. When you encounter someone from your in-group, your brain floods with chemicals that promote cooperation and trust, while simultaneously lowering your critical defenses. You interpret their ambiguous actions charitably, attributing success to their inherent abilities and failures to external circumstances. Conversely, when encountering someone from an out-group, these processes reverse themselves almost automatically. Their successes become luck or deception, while their failures confirm negative stereotypes. The remarkable aspect of in-group bias is that it requires virtually no substance to activate. Research has demonstrated that people will show strong in-group favoritism toward complete strangers if they are randomly assigned to the same arbitrary group, even when that group has no real history, shared values, or common purpose. This suggests that the bias exists not because our groups are genuinely superior or more trustworthy, but because belonging itself activates a psychological reward system. We have normalized this bias so thoroughly that it feels natural and even moral to prefer our own group, and we rarely recognize how often our judgments of fairness, competence, and character are filtered through this invisible lens. The consequences ripple outward in ways both mundane and catastrophic. The job candidate who reminds the interviewer of themselves gets the benefit of the doubt. The political opponent's policy proposal is dismissed without genuine consideration. And throughout history, the most brutal conflicts have been justified by the conviction that one's own group deserves protection or superiority, while others deserve suspicion or harm. Imagine walking into a bookstore and seeing shelves lined with autobiographies of successful entrepreneurs, all of them detailing their journey from nothing to extraordinary wealth, and you begin to believe that their strategies, their mindset, and their particular approach to risk are the golden formula for success because you only ever encounter the stories of those who made it, while the thousands who tried the exact same methods and failed fade silently into obscurity, leaving no memoir. No speaking engagements, no inspiring narrative to be discovered. This is survivorship bias, a subtle yet pervasive cognitive pattern where we systematically examine only the cases that survived some process of selection or filtering, and then draw sweeping conclusions about causation based entirely on what we can observe, completely blind to all the similar cases that did not survive and therefore cannot speak to us from the shelves or the podcasts or the motivational stages where we encounter them. The mechanism that allows this bias to persist is deceptively simple. Success leaves a trail of visible artifacts, books and interviews and case studies, and LinkedIn profiles that broadcast their winning methodologies to anyone who will listen. Whereas failure tends to be a quieter affair, a private disappointment that rarely gets documented or shared widely, creating an inherent informational asymmetry where the successful voices echo loudly while the unsuccessful voices simply vanish from our field of perception entirely. During World War II, the military wanted to understand why so many aircraft were being shot down, so they examined the planes that returned from combat missions to see where the bullet holes were concentrated, and their initial analysis suggested that they should reinforce the fuselage and wings where the damage was heaviest, until a statistician named Abraham Wald pointed out the crucial flaw in their reasoning. The planes they were examining were only the ones that survived and made it back to base, which meant the locations with the fewest bullet holes were precisely the locations where hits were catastrophic and fatal, because those aircraft never returned at all, and this realization completely reversed their reinforcement strategy. We encounter survivorship bias when we read startup success stories and assume that the founder's aggressive risk-taking and unconventional path were essential ingredients, when the truth is that thousands of people with identical strategies crashed and burned spectacularly and simply never wrote a book about it. And we see it when we study the habits of billionaires as though they possessed some secret knowledge, when many of those habits are randomly distributed across people of all income levels. And the billionaires we studied simply happen to be born at the right time or inherit the right genes or benefit from luck that had nothing to do with their morning routine or their reading habits or their exercise schedule. Yet we extract these practices as though they were causal levers rather than correlational noise filtered through a survivor selection process. Imagine you hold a particular belief about politics, religion, morality, or even something as simple as the best way to spend a weekend, and you find yourself genuinely surprised when you discover that not everyone shares your view. You might think to yourself that surely most reasonable people would agree with you, that those who disagree are simply uninformed or perhaps a bit unreasonable, and that your perspective represents something closer to a consensus than it actually does. This tendency to overestimate how many people share our beliefs, values, and behaviors is known as the false consensus effect, and it operates quietly in nearly every social interaction we have without our conscious awareness. When we look around our social circles, at our families, our workplaces, and our online communities, we tend to notice and remember the people who agree with us far more readily than those who do not, creating a distorted mental sample of the broader population. If your closest friends all vote the same way you do, enjoy the same music, practice the same religion or lack thereof, and hold similar political views, you naturally begin to assume that these perspectives are far more widespread than they actually are, because your brain relies on what psychologists call the availability heuristic. The mechanism behind this bias is rooted in how our minds process information and construct our understanding of the social world around us. We are drawn to people who think like us through a process called homophily, the tendency to associate with others similar to ourselves, and this self-selection creates echo chambers where our views are constantly reinforced and validated. Additionally, when we encounter someone who disagrees with us, we often attribute their disagreement to some flaw in their reasoning, their intelligence, their access to information, or their fundamental character, rather than recognizing that they might simply have arrived at a different conclusion through equally valid reasoning. This asymmetry in how we judge agreement versus disagreement allows us to maintain the illusion that our views are more universally held than they actually are. The false consensus effect persists despite having no logical foundation because it serves several psychological functions that feel rewarding and protective. It provides us with a sense of social validation and security, allowing us to feel that our choices and beliefs are normal, reasonable, and widely endorsed rather than idiosyncratic or outlying. It also simplifies the social world considerably, reducing the cognitive load required to navigate it by allowing us to assume that most people think roughly the way we do, which requires far less mental effort than constantly updating our understanding of genuine human diversity. Over time, we have built entire social and informational structures that reinforce and amplify this bias, from social media algorithms that show us content similar to what we already engage with, to the self-segregation of communities and neighborhoods, to the very human tendency to seek out news sources and media that align with our existing perspectives. Imagine walking into a restaurant on a quiet evening and noticing that one table is packed with people laughing and eating while the other tables sit nearly empty, and without any real investigation into the quality of the food or service, you feel drawn to sit near the crowded table, operating under the assumption that if many people are gathered there, it must be worth your time and attention. This is the bandwagon effect in its most visible form, a cognitive bias where we tend to believe or do something primarily because many other people believe or do it, creating a cascade of conformity that spreads through populations like an invisible current that shapes decisions we believe are entirely our own. The mechanism behind this bias runs deep into our evolutionary past, rooted in the ancient survival advantage of following the crowd, because in ancestral environments, when a large group of people moved in a particular direction or avoided a certain area, individual members who questioned this collective wisdom often faced danger alone, which meant that natural selection favored those whose brains were wired to find comfort and confidence in numbers. This same neural architecture persists within us today, even though the threats have fundamentally changed, and now when we see millions of people adopting a particular fashion trend, using a specific social media platform, supporting a political candidate, or purchasing a best-selling product, our brains interpret this mass participation as a form of evidence, as if the sheer weight of numbers somehow validates the choice, even though popularity is disconnected from quality or correctness. We witness this bias operating everywhere from financial markets, where investors rush to buy stocks simply because prices are rising and others are buying, to vaccine hesitancy, where vaccine adoption rates in communities influence individual decision-making more than scientific evidence does, to entertainment preferences where shows become hits not necessarily because they are better, but because they gain initial momentum, and then everyone watches them because everyone is watching them. The persistence of this bias, despite our logical capacity to recognize it, stems from the fact that the bandwagon effect operates beneath conscious awareness most of the time, presenting conformity as personal choice rather than herd behavior. And we have collectively normalized this influence so thoroughly that we rarely stop to question why we want what everyone else wants or believe what everyone else believes. Treating our conformity as natural preference rather than cognitive bias, gently steering us toward the same conclusions that billions of others have reached. The tragedy of this invisibility is that we surrender our individual judgment to collective momentum without realizing the exchange we've made, and by the time we recognize that we've adopted a belief or behavior primarily because others have, we've already invested our identity and reputation in the choice, making it psychologically difficult to reverse course even when evidence suggests we should. Imagine two hospitals presenting the survival rates of a new surgical procedure to their patients, and though the underlying statistics are identical, one hospital tells you that 90% of patients survive the operation, while the other tells you that 10% do not survive, and you find yourself far more inclined to trust the first hospital and choose the procedure based on that framing alone. Even though mathematically these statements contain exactly the same information and should produce identical decision-making outcomes in a rational mind. The framing effect describes this peculiar vulnerability where the way information is presented to us, rather than the actual content of that information, fundamentally alters our perception of it and subsequently changes the choices we make in response. When a financial advisor frames an investment opportunity by emphasizing potential gains, your brain lights up with optimism and possibility. But when that same advisor reframes the identical investment by emphasizing potential losses, your brain retreats into caution and fear. And this shift happens not because the investment has changed, but because your mind processes gains and losses through entirely different psychological valences. This effect persists because our brains are not truly rational calculating machines, but rather evolved survival systems that respond more powerfully to the emotional coloring of language than to the objective reality it describes. And language is inherently a tool of framing, since every statement about the world is constructed from countless possible word choices and perspectives. We encounter this bias constantly in consumer marketing, where products are framed as saving you money rather than costing you money, in political messaging, where policies are framed around protection rather than restriction or vice versa, and in healthcare contexts, where treatments are described through different lenses of the same outcome. The framing effect persists despite our awareness of it, because fighting it requires constant metacognitive effort and active skepticism toward every piece of information we encounter. And most people lack either the cognitive resources or the motivation to engage in such exhaustive analysis of every decision they face throughout their day. So instead we remain subtly, but persistently shaped by the architecture of how choices are presented to us, rather than by any objective features of those choices themselves. The recognition of this vulnerability has spawned an entire field of choice architecture, where designers intentionally frame options to nudge people toward particular decisions, whether for their genuine benefit, as in pension plans with automatic enrollment, or for corporate profit, as in how streaming services highlight certain content over others, making the question of who controls the frame and toward what end one of the most consequential power dynamics of modern life. Imagine a patient enters a clinic complaining of chronic pain, and the doctor hands them a pill, explaining with complete confidence that this medication will significantly reduce their discomfort within the hour. The patient takes the pill, and remarkably, their pain does begin to subside. Days pass, and the symptoms continue to improve. Only later do they discover that the pill contained no active pharmaceutical ingredient whatsoever, merely an inert substance like lactose or cellulose, a fake treatment designed purely to test their expectations. Yet the relief they experienced was undeniably real, measurable in their brain activity, their body's stress hormones, and their behavioral reports. This is the placebo effect in its most fundamental form, the power of belief and expectation to create genuine physiological change in our bodies, independent of any pharmacological mechanism. The mechanism operates through several interconnected psychological and neurobiological pathways that together constitute one of medicine's most humbling paradoxes. When we receive treatment while in a heightened state of expectation and hope, our brain releases neurotransmitters like endorphins and dopamine, which genuinely reduce pain perception and improve mood. The rituals surrounding medical treatment, the white coat of the doctor, the official setting, the confident delivery of the diagnosis and prescription, all these contextual elements prime our nervous system toward healing, triggering the same neural circuits that genuine medication would activate. Our brains are prediction machines constantly generating models of what should happen next, and when we expect relief, our perceptual systems literally filter and interpret sensory information in ways that align with that expectation, making symptoms genuinely feel less severe. What persists as profoundly puzzling is that the placebo effect works even when we consciously know we're receiving a placebo, even when we understand intellectually that the pill has no active ingredient, suggesting that conscious knowledge alone cannot override the deeper machinery of our expectations and our embodied beliefs about healing. This reveals a humbling truth about the architecture of human consciousness. Our bodies respond not merely to chemical reality, but to the narrative we construct around our treatment, to the stories we tell ourselves about healing, and to the deeply social nature of our biology, which remains fundamentally attuned to the presence, attention, and belief of others around us. In clinical practice, this recognition has transformed how physicians approach treatment itself. The therapeutic relationship, the quality of explanation, the time spent listening have become understood as active ingredients rather than mere accompaniments to pharmacology. The placebo effect thus stands as a reminder that healing has always been as much an art of human connection and meaning-making as it is a science of molecular mechanisms. Imagine you are evaluating the performance of a colleague who has worked with you for 3 years, and you are asked to provide feedback on their overall reliability and competence. Despite the fact that they have been consistently excellent for the vast majority of that time, delivering quality work and meeting deadlines with remarkable regularity, you find yourself focusing heavily on the 2 recent projects where they missed deadlines or produced work that required significant revision. When asked to summarize their performance, you hear yourself describing them as unreliable and somewhat inconsistent, even though the mathematical reality of their track record tells a completely different story. This is recency bias, and it operates with such subtle persistence that we often fail to notice its influence on our judgments and decisions. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is rooted in the accessibility of information in our working memory. Recent events and information are cognitively more available to us because they occupy our conscious attention more readily, and our minds naturally treat what is easily accessible as what is most representative or important. When we evaluate, decide, or form opinions, we unconsciously weight recent experiences more heavily because they require less mental effort to retrieve and hold in our awareness compared to older information that must be excavated from deeper memory storage. This creates a fundamental distortion in how we process patterns and trends, causing us to behave as though the most recent data points are somehow more truthful or predictive than a larger body of accumulated evidence. What makes recency bias particularly persistent is that it operates beneath the threshold of conscious awareness in most situations, and even when we intellectually understand that it exists, we struggle to counteract its influence on our actual judgments. We have normalized this way of thinking across nearly every domain of human decision-making, from medical diagnoses, where doctors may overweight a patient's recent symptoms while overlooking their longer medical history, to investment decisions, where market movements in the past few weeks seem more significant than fundamental economic trends, to relationships where a recent argument can suddenly overshadow months of genuine connection and understanding. The bias persists not because we lack the ability to think differently, but because our cognitive architecture naturally privileges the present and the near past as guides for understanding reality. This tendency becomes even more powerful when the recent events carry emotional weight. A dramatic failure or unexpected success imprints itself more vividly in memory than routine competence, making it exponentially harder to maintain perspective on what the broader evidence actually shows. Understanding this mechanism is the first step toward building safeguards, such as explicitly reviewing historical data before making judgments or forcing ourselves to quantify patterns rather than relying on vivid recollection. Imagine walking into a job interview where the first thing you do is stumble slightly over your words during your opening introduction. And despite spending the next hour demonstrating exceptional knowledge, technical expertise, and thoughtful responses to complex questions, the interviewer's final assessment remains influenced by that initial awkward moment. This is the primacy effect in action, a cognitive bias where the first information we encounter about something or someone carries disproportionate weight in shaping our overall impression and judgment, often persisting even when subsequent information contradicts or substantially outweighs that initial data. The mechanism behind this phenomenon operates through several interconnected psychological processes that begin the moment we first encounter new information. When we receive initial information about a person, situation, or concept, our brain immediately begins constructing a mental framework or schema to organize and interpret everything that follows. This framework acts as a lens through which all subsequent information is filtered, interpreted, and evaluated. Information that aligns with this initial framework is readily accepted and integrated, while information that contradicts it requires significantly more cognitive effort to process and may be actively discounted or reinterpreted to fit the existing schema. Additionally, we tend to pay more attention to and encode more deeply the first pieces of information we receive, which makes them more memorable and accessible in our memory, creating a stronger neural trace that influences future judgments and decisions. The primacy effect persists despite its illogical foundation, because we rarely have the opportunity or motivation to completely rebuild our impressions from scratch. We encounter initial information when we are often fresh and attentive, making those early inputs more vivid and emotionally resonant than later details we might absorb while distracted or fatigued. Furthermore, we have normalized the tendency to form quick judgments based on limited information as a necessary survival mechanism. Even though modern life rarely requires such rapid assessment, yet we continue applying this ancient pattern to contemporary situations where careful, nuanced evaluation would serve us far better. Understanding the primacy effect becomes particularly crucial in our digital age, where first impressions are often formed through curated social media profiles, algorithmic feeds, and headline-driven news cycles that prioritize initial impact over substantive truth, meaning that the information we encounter first is increasingly designed to be emotionally compelling rather than comprehensive or accurate. By recognizing this bias in ourselves, we can consciously implement strategies such as seeking out diverse perspectives before finalizing judgments, revisiting our initial impressions with new information, and deliberately pausing before we allow that first encounter to calcify into an unchangeable conviction. Imagine a person who notices that whenever they wear their red sweater to work, something good happens, and gradually they begin to believe that the red sweater brings them luck, so they wear it more often on important days, and when positive outcomes occur, the correlation feels undeniable and real to them, even though the sweater had nothing to do with the result. This is illusory correlation, the tendency of our minds to perceive a relationship between two variables that have little to no actual connection, creating patterns where none truly exist. The mechanism underlying this bias operates through a filtering process in our attention and memory, where our brains are naturally designed to detect patterns and connections because pattern recognition has historically served our survival. Yet this same mechanism becomes overactive when we fail to properly account for base rates and coincidence. When we encounter information that fits our existing beliefs or expectations, we tend to notice it more readily and remember it more vividly, while we simultaneously ignore or forget evidence that contradicts our perceived pattern, a process known as selective attention and confirmation bias working in tandem. We see a person with red hair who is temperamental, and then we see another redhead who is also quick-tempered, and suddenly we have constructed a narrative that red hair correlates with a fiery personality, despite the countless redheads we have encountered or heard about who are calm and peaceful. The persistence of illusory correlation is particularly striking because it survives even when we have access to statistical information that would disconfirm it, suggesting that the bias operates at a level of cognition that feels more like direct perception than like reasoned judgment. We have normalized this tendency to such an extent that it underlies many superstitions, prejudices, and false beliefs that become embedded in cultures and passed down through generations, creating feedback loops where our expectations shape what we notice, which then reinforces our expectations further. Understanding illusory correlation is therefore crucial because it reveals how easily our minds can construct false certainties that feel absolutely real to us, and recognizing this tendency in ourselves allows us to pause before acting on perceived patterns, asking whether we are truly seeing a meaningful connection or simply noticing what we expect to notice. By cultivating this metacognitive awareness, this ability to observe our own pattern-seeking mind in action, we create space between impulse and belief, allowing us to ask more rigorous questions about the evidence we have actually collected versus the evidence we have merely imagined. And in doing so, we begin to dismantle the illusory correlations that have quietly shaped our decisions, relationships, and understanding of the world. Consider the moment when someone sits down to take a test they have barely studied for, convinced they will pass with flying colors, or when a new entrepreneur launches their business with unwavering certainty that their idea will succeed, where 90% of similar ventures fail within the first 5 years. Or when a driver believes themselves to be far more skilled than average behind the wheel despite statistics showing that the vast majority of people rate their own driving ability as above average. An obvious logical impossibility that somehow persists across populations and cultures. The overconfidence effect describes this systematic tendency for people to hold an overly optimistic view of their abilities, the likelihood of positive outcomes in their lives, and their general knowledge about the world, creating a gap between what they believe they can achieve and what they actually demonstrate they are capable of achieving. This bias emerges from several interlocking psychological mechanisms, beginning with selective memory and attention, whereby people tend to remember their successes far more vividly than their failures, constructing a skewed internal narrative that emphasizes their competence while minimizing evidence to the contrary, and continuing through illusory superiority, the particular tendency to rate one's own abilities as better than one's peers while simultaneously rating peers' abilities as worse than average. Creating a distorted landscape of self-perception. The effect persists because it operates largely outside conscious awareness, feeling like objective truth rather than distortion, and because moderate overconfidence actually confers certain advantages in motivation and resilience, allowing people to attempt difficult tasks they might otherwise abandon before even trying, so evolution may have favored this bias as a functional trade-off despite its costs. We see this normalized throughout society in the form of motivational speaking, self-help literature, and cultural narratives that celebrate confidence as an inherent virtue, while rarely examining whether that confidence is calibrated to actual ability or merely to the comforting stories we tell ourselves about our own potential. Yet this cultural valorization of unfounded confidence creates a paradox. While it may help individuals attempt ambitious goals, it simultaneously leaves them poorly equipped to recognize their limitations, seek necessary help, or adjust course when evidence of failure accumulates, often resulting in spectacular collapses that might have been prevented by a more calibrated assessment of reality. The trader who loses their entire portfolio betting on a sure thing, the surgeon whose confidence in their own steady hands leads them to operate beyond their actual competence, the politician convinced of their moral superiority while overlooking their own corruption. These are the moments when overconfidence transforms from a mild cognitive quirk into a consequential force that damages not only the overconfident individual, but everyone depending on their judgment. Imagine you are an expert in your field, someone who has spent years mastering a particular skill or subject matter, and you sit down to explain your expertise to someone encountering it for the first time, only to find yourself frustrated by their apparent inability to grasp concepts that seem blindingly obvious to you. When in reality, the problem lies not with their intelligence, but with a systematic blind spot in your own perception that prevents you from remembering what it felt like to not know these things. This phenomenon is known as the curse of knowledge, and it describes a cognitive bias wherein once we have learned something, once that information has been integrated into our mental framework, we become almost incapable of accurately recalling or reconstructing the state of mind we possessed before we acquired that knowledge. The expert software engineer cannot fathom why a beginner struggles with loops and functions, because those concepts are now so deeply embedded in their thinking that they have forgotten the process of first encountering these ideas. forgotten the confusion and the mental effort required to rewire their understanding of how computers actually process instructions. The curse of knowledge operates through a mechanism of accessibility and automaticity. Information that has become highly accessible to our minds, information that we can retrieve and apply almost without conscious effort, becomes psychologically invisible to us, and we forget entirely that this accessibility is a product of extensive learning and repetition rather than something that should be intuitive to everyone. When we try to explain something we know well, we naturally skip steps, we leave gaps in our reasoning, we use jargon without definition, not because we are trying to be condescending, but because these shortcuts are now the path of least resistance for our brains. We literally cannot see the missing pieces because our minds have developed such efficient pathways through the knowledge that those steps are no longer discrete or visible to our conscious attention. What makes this bias persist is that people rarely receive genuine feedback about how incomprehensible their explanations actually are. Listeners may nod politely, may pretend to understand to avoid embarrassment, and the expert walks away believing they communicated clearly when in fact they have left their audience confused and frustrated. Over time, experts become increasingly isolated from the perspective of the novice, and they begin to attribute failures in communication to the listener's lack of ability rather than to their own inability to bridge the gap between deep expertise and fundamental ignorance, creating a self-perpetuating cycle where patience diminishes, and the expert becomes even less capable of explaining their knowledge in ways that actually reach people who genuinely want to learn. Imagine walking into a crowded room wearing a shirt with a small stain on it, or perhaps your hair is slightly disheveled from the wind outside, and immediately you feel as though every eye in the room has noticed this imperfection and is quietly judging you for it. You catch yourself walking a little differently, speaking a little more carefully, repositioning yourself to hide the flaw, convinced that this minor detail has become the focal point of everyone's attention and internal commentary. This is the spotlight effect, a cognitive bias where we dramatically overestimate the degree to which other people notice and care about our appearance, behavior, and mistakes. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is rooted in what psychologists call egocentric bias, which is our natural tendency to view the world primarily through the lens of our own experience and concerns. When we become aware of something about ourselves, whether it is a physical flaw, an awkward social moment, or an embarrassing comment we made, that information becomes cognitively salient and dominant in our own minds, and we unconsciously project this same level of attention and concern onto others around us. Because the stain on your shirt occupies your thoughts, you assume it must occupy theirs as well, even though in reality those around you are typically consumed with their own insecurities, concerns, and observations rather than scrutinizing you. Research has consistently demonstrated that people vastly overestimate how much others notice their mistakes, their appearance, and their social blunders, often by a factor of 2 or 3 times. Yet despite understanding this bias intellectually, we continue to experience it as vividly and powerfully as ever, because our subjective experience of being the center of our own world is so fundamental to human consciousness that logic alone cannot easily override it. We know theoretically that nobody is watching us as closely as we watch ourselves, and yet the feeling persists, shaping how we move through social spaces and influencing the stories we tell ourselves about how others perceive us. The irony is that this bias often becomes self-fulfilling. Our anxiety about being noticed causes us to behave more awkwardly, which paradoxically draws the very attention we feared. Yet even then, most observers attribute our discomfort to nervousness rather than the minor flaw we were obsessing over. Understanding this disconnect between our internal narrative and external reality can be liberating, though the spotlight effect reminds us that knowledge alone rarely quiets the ancient voice inside us that still feels perpetually on stage. Perhaps this is why the most socially confident people are often those who have simply accepted that others are too preoccupied with their own perceived flaws to scrutinize ours, a realization that paradoxically makes them less noticeable precisely because they stop trying so hard to be invisible. In this way, the spotlight effect reveals a deeper truth. The freedom we seek from self-consciousness comes not from being perfect, but from recognizing that perfection itself is largely invisible to an audience far too absorbed in their own performance to notice ours. Imagine a person who has worked hard their entire life, followed every rule, made sensible choices, and yet finds themselves facing a terminal illness at 50 years old, while someone across the street who smokes, drinks, and rarely exercises lives to 95 in perfect health. When we hear this story, there is often an instinctive discomfort that arises within us, a subtle pressure to reframe the narrative in ways that restore a sense of cosmic balance and fairness. We might find ourselves thinking that the ill person must have been stressed from overworking, or perhaps they had a genetic predisposition that good behavior could not overcome. We search for hidden flaws or secret mistakes that would explain why they deserved this outcome, as though the universe operates according to a ledger that ensures good deeds are rewarded and bad ones are punished. This is the just world hypothesis at work, a deeply embedded cognitive tendency to believe that the world is fundamentally fair, that people generally get what they deserve, and that outcomes are proportional to moral worth or effort. The psychological mechanism underlying this bias runs quite deep. As social creatures navigating an inherently chaotic and unpredictable world, humans have a profound psychological need to believe in order and predictability. If we accept that bad things happen to good people randomly, if we acknowledge that effort does not always yield results, and if we truly internalize that the universe is indifferent to our virtues, then we are left in a terrifying existential void where our actions feel meaningless and our future feels wholly uncontrollable. The just world hypothesis protects us from this anxiety by providing a comforting narrative framework where outcomes make sense, where there is a reason for everything, and where the future feels somewhat navigable because we can anticipate consequences. When we encounter someone suffering poverty, we unconsciously ask what they did wrong, what poor choices they made, what character flaw led them there, because accepting that hardworking people can be born into disadvantage or struck by misfortune regardless of their virtue destabilizes our sense of safety and control. This bias becomes especially pernicious in how it perpetuates judgment and inequality across societies, as we systematically blame victims for their circumstances while overlooking the role of luck, circumstance, systemic barriers, and random events that shape human lives far more than we acknowledge. Even as we grow older and accumulate evidence that contradicts this hypothesis, even as we witness countless examples of unfair outcomes and undeserved suffering, the just world hypothesis persists because the alternative is an anxiety so profound that our minds actively resist it, continuously reaching for explanations that restore the comforting illusion of a just universe. Imagine you are sitting in traffic on your commute home and another driver cuts you off without signaling, nearly causing an accident. Your immediate thought is that they are reckless, aggressive, and irresponsible. Perhaps they are texting or simply do not care about safety. You hold this judgment firmly, certain that their character is defined by this dangerous behavior. Yet later that same evening, you yourself cut off another driver while making a turn because you were distracted by an important phone call from your doctor, and you think nothing of it. When someone honks or gestures angrily at you, you feel a flash of irritation at their overreaction, knowing full well that you are normally a careful driver and that this was merely a momentary lapse caused by legitimate circumstances beyond your control. This fundamental asymmetry in how we interpret the actions of others versus our own actions is the actor-observer bias, a pervasive cognitive pattern that quietly shapes nearly every social interaction we experience. When we are the actor, when we are the one performing an action, we tend to attribute our behavior to external situational factors, to the pressures and constraints and unexpected events in our environment that forced our hand or distracted our attention. We see ourselves as victims of circumstance, reasonable people navigating an unpredictable world. But when we are the observer, watching someone else commit what appears to be the same behavior, we flip our explanatory framework entirely and attribute their actions to their internal characteristics, their personality, their values, or their inherent disposition. The other driver was not a distracted person in a temporary situation, but rather a reckless person by nature. This bias emerges from the fundamental difference in what information is available to us in each role. When we perform an action, we have vivid awareness of all the situational pressures we faced, all the contextual details that led us to behave this way, all the competing demands on our attention and resources. Our environment is salient and visible to us because we are embedded within it. But when we observe others, we have no access to their internal experience, no window into their constraints or pressures or competing concerns. What we see is simply their behavior, divorced from context, and so we fill in the gaps with inferences about who they are as people rather than acknowledging the situations they face. The psychological mechanism amplifies because of a phenomenon called the fundamental attribution error or correspondence bias, whereby humans have a natural tendency to overestimate personality factors and underestimate situational factors when explaining behavior. This bias persists and remains largely invisible to us despite decades of psychological research documenting its existence, partly because it serves certain psychological functions that feel comforting, and partly because correcting for it requires genuine cognitive effort and self-awareness that we rarely apply to our moment-to-moment judgments of others. Imagine you walk into a hospital and a doctor tells you that you have tested positive for a rare disease that affects only 1 in 10,000 people in the population, and the test itself is 99% accurate. Your heart begins to race. You feel your life changing in an instant. The doctor seems serious, the test seems definitive, and the numbers seem stark and unavoidable. Yet the probability that you actually have this disease is far lower than you might think, perhaps closer to 1 in 100 rather than 99 in 100, because you have neglected to consider the base rate, which is the fundamental frequency of the disease in the general population from which you were drawn. This is base rate neglect, and it is one of the most pervasive and consequential errors in human reasoning, particularly when we encounter new information that feels immediately relevant to our situation. The mechanism underlying this bias is fundamentally about attention and cognitive allocation. When we receive specific, vivid information about ourselves or our circumstances, that information captures our mental resources so completely that we fail to properly weigh the broader statistical context in which that information exists. The test result feels personal and immediate, while the base rate feels abstract and distant. Our brains are tuned by evolution to respond to concrete threats and specific signals, not to abstract statistical backgrounds. We see the positive test and our threat detection system activates instantly, overwhelming the quieter voice of statistical reasoning that whispers about how rare the disease actually is in the general population. What makes this bias particularly insidious is that it persists even when we are explicitly told the base rates, even when we are trained in statistics, and even when we have time to think carefully about our reasoning. Medical professionals, business analysts, and probability experts all fall prey to base rate neglect regularly. A company might receive a warning signal about a particular employee and immediately assume the signal indicates actual wrongdoing, while ignoring the fact that false positives are actually quite common given how many employees are monitored. A manager might believe an applicant is unqualified based on one failed interview question, without properly considering how many truly capable people fail individual questions under pressure. The bias has become so normalized in human cognition that we rarely question whether we are actually considering the base rate at all, and instead we move forward with decisions based on the vivid, specific information in front of us, trusting that such information must be more reliable than mere statistical background knowledge. Yet when we take a moment to perform the basic Bayesian calculation, updating our initial belief about disease prevalence with the likelihood of the test result, we often find that even a highly accurate test cannot overcome a sufficiently low base rate, a mathematical reality that remains counterintuitive to our intuitive minds and serves as a humbling reminder that our gut feelings about probability are frequently, systematically wrong. Imagine sitting at a roulette table where the ball has landed on red 7 times in a row, and you find yourself absolutely convinced that black must come next. So you place a substantial bet on black because surely the odds demand it, yet the ball lands on red again, and somehow this only strengthens your certainty that black is coming soon, so you bet again and again, watching your money disappear while your conviction grows stronger with each spin that defies your expectations. This is the gambler's fallacy, one of the most persistent and costly cognitive distortions that humans experience, a profound misunderstanding of probability and randomness that affects not only casino players but investors, lottery participants, medical decisions, and countless everyday situations where we are trying to predict uncertain outcomes. The mechanism underlying this bias is fundamentally rooted in our brain's inability to truly grasp what randomness means and how independent events actually function. When we observe a sequence of outcomes, our pattern recognition systems automatically engage, searching for meaning and structure in what we see. And when we notice that something has happened multiple times in a row, we unconsciously assume that the probability of the opposite outcome must increase to balance things out, as though the world keeps some invisible ledger that must eventually equilibrate. We reason that if a fair coin has come up heads 5 times consecutively, then tails simply must be more likely on the next flip, because that's how fairness works, or so our intuition insists, completely ignoring the mathematical reality that each coin flip has exactly a 50% chance of being tails regardless of what happened before. The fallacy persists even among people who intellectually understand probability, because the emotional experience of witnessing an unlikely streak activates our narrative-making systems so powerfully that our logical knowledge becomes nearly inaccessible in the moment. We have somehow normalized this thinking in our culture through gambling industries, marketing, and popular entertainment that reinforce the idea that patterns matter and that luck operates according to some balancing principle, when in fact independent random events have no memory, no conscience, and no interest in creating the kind of balance that our deeply pattern-seeking brains desperately desire to perceive. The cruel irony is that this bias becomes even more entrenched after losses, because each failed prediction feels like evidence that you're close to being right, that the next bet will finally vindicate your system, transforming the very losses that should disconfirm your theory into fuel that strengthens your conviction that you've discovered a pattern where none exists. This is why casinos remain profitable despite offering games with known mathematical edges. They don't need to exploit our inability to calculate odds, only our inability to accept that past results genuinely tell us nothing about future spins, flips, or draws, making the gambler's fallacy less a failure of math and more a failure of our intuition to surrender to true uncertainty. Imagine you have two investment opportunities presented to you on the same day, and both involve the same amount of money. The first option guarantees you a modest gain of $500 with certainty, while the second option offers a 50-50 chance of gaining $1,000 or gaining nothing at all. From a purely mathematical standpoint, both options have an expected value of $500, yet the vast majority of people will choose the first option, the guaranteed gain, even though the second option is mathematically equivalent. Now imagine a different scenario where you stand to lose money instead. You are presented with a choice between a certain loss of $500 or a 50-50 chance of losing $1,000 or losing nothing at all. When the frame shifts to losses, people suddenly become risk-seeking, choosing the gamble over the certain loss, despite the fact that the mathematics remains identical. This asymmetry between how we treat gains and losses reveals a fundamental principle operating within human psychology called loss aversion, which describes our tendency to feel the sting of losing something roughly twice as intensely as the pleasure we feel from gaining an equivalent amount. The mechanism underlying this bias appears to be rooted in our evolutionary past, where our ancestors faced genuine survival pressures and the loss of resources like food or shelter could mean death, while equivalent gains might merely improve comfort. This ancient wiring created neural pathways that prioritized the prevention of losses over the pursuit of gains, making our brains extraordinarily sensitive to potential losses and driving us toward protective behaviors even when logic suggests those behaviors are irrational. We witness loss aversion playing out constantly in modern life, from people holding onto losing stocks far too long because they cannot bear to realize the loss, to homeowners refusing to sell properties at reasonable prices because they became anchored to higher valuations they once saw, to individuals staying in unsatisfying relationships because the fear of losing the time and emotional investment they have already made feels more powerful than the potential benefits of leaving. Despite our capacity for rational thought, and despite having access to information and frameworks that could help us overcome this bias, we continue to be dominated by the emotional weight of potential losses, organizing our financial decisions, our career choices, and our personal relationships around the avoidance of loss rather than the pursuit of gain. This pattern persists because the emotional experience of loss remains viscerally real and immediate in a way that abstract probability calculations are not, and because our brains have become so accustomed to prioritizing loss prevention that we rarely pause to question whether our avoidance behaviors are serving us well or merely perpetuating stagnation in the name of protecting what we already have. Consider the person who has worked at the same company for 15 years in a role that no longer challenges them, earning a salary that has barely kept pace with inflation, in an office environment that drains their energy each morning. When asked why they don't pursue a different job, a better opportunity, or even a complete career change, they offer a series of explanations that sound reasonable on the surface. The benefits are familiar, the commute is predictable, they know how things work here, and making a change feels risky. What they're experiencing is status quo bias, a powerful cognitive tendency that makes us prefer the current state of affairs, even when evidence suggests that changing would improve our lives substantially. The mechanism underlying this bias is rooted in loss aversion, which is the tendency to weight potential losses far more heavily than equivalent gains. When we consider staying in our current situation, we focus on what we already have and take for granted, but when we consider leaving or changing, we mentally highlight what we might lose. The comfort of knowing what to expect, even if that expectation involves dissatisfaction, feels safer than the uncertainty of an unknown alternative, and our brains treat the loss of the familiar as a much larger threat than the gain of something potentially better. We have normalized this bias so thoroughly into our lives that we rarely recognize it as a bias at all. Instead, we call it responsibility, prudence, or stability, wrapping the fear of change in the language of virtue and wisdom. People stay in relationships that have grown cold, maintain habits that no longer serve them, live in houses that are too expensive or impractical, and accept health conditions that could be improved, all while the status quo quietly calculates itself as the safest option. This persistence happens because change requires effort, decision-making, and a tolerance for uncertainty, whereas doing nothing is the path of least resistance, requiring no action whatsoever. The status quo becomes the default, the thing that happens automatically when we don't actively choose something else, and over time, this default transforms into identity and justification. We tell ourselves that we are being realistic about the world's constraints, when in truth we are simply exhausted by the imagined effort of change, and so the status quo becomes not just our circumstance but our identity. The person we believe ourselves to be, fixed and unchangeable, trapped not by external barriers, but by our own inability to distinguish between what we have chosen and what we have simply accepted by default. The tragedy is that this distinction matters enormously. Choice implies agency and the possibility of revision, while default acceptance implies surrender, a slow erosion of the self into whatever shape the world has already carved out. And yet the moment we recognize this pattern, the moment we see that staying is itself a choice, one we are making repeatedly, the spell begins to break, and the status quo loses its invisible grip on our imagination. Imagine you are presented with two options to improve your health and reduce your risk of illness. The first option eliminates 90% of your current health risks through a comprehensive lifestyle change that requires moderate effort and commitment. The second option eliminates only 10% of your risks, but requires almost no effort at all, merely taking a simple vitamin supplement each morning. Despite the mathematical reality that the first option provides 9 times more protection, many people find themselves drawn to the second option, experiencing a profound sense of relief and satisfaction from knowing they are doing something, anything to reduce their risk, even if that reduction is negligible. This is zero-risk bias in action, a cognitive phenomenon wherein people exhibit a disproportionate preference for eliminating a small risk entirely rather than substantially reducing a larger risk. The psychological mechanism underlying this bias operates through the human mind's attraction to certainty and the emotional comfort of absolute protection. When we perceive that we can eliminate a risk completely, we experience a distinctive psychological relief that feels qualitatively different from merely improving our odds, even when the actual safety benefit is dramatically inferior. Our brains seem to weight the difference between zero risk and any amount of risk as infinitely large, rather than evaluating risk reduction on a linear scale where larger reductions should naturally be preferred over smaller ones. This distortion in our risk perception creates a powerful motivation to pursue complete elimination of minor threats while ignoring substantial reductions in major threats. The bias persists because it feels logical within our subjective experience, because the emotional satisfaction of achieving perfect safety in one domain overwhelms our rational calculation of where our resources might be better directed. We have normalized this preference in countless domains, from purchasing comprehensive insurance coverage against unlikely scenarios to spending significant money on security features that protect against rare events while neglecting preventative measures that would address far more common dangers. The persistence of zero-risk bias suggests that human decision-making is fundamentally shaped not by what protects us most effectively, but by what allows us to feel most secure, a distinction that becomes quieter and quieter the longer we sit with it. Perhaps this explains why we install expensive home security systems while neglecting the far deadlier risks of poor diet and sedentary living. or why we obsess over airplane safety statistics while driving recklessly to our destinations. The visible, imaginary threat that can be theoretically erased holds more power over us than the invisible, statistical certainty that shapes our actual mortality. Imagine you inherit a coffee mug from a relative, nothing particularly special or valuable, just a ceramic mug with a faded design that has sat in a cabinet for years. And suddenly, when someone offers to buy it from you, you find yourself asking for a price that seems completely unreasonable, far more than you would have ever paid for that same mug if you saw it in a store. And this peculiar valuation gap reveals something profound about how human beings relate to ownership and possession. The endowment effect describes our tendency to ascribe greater value to things simply because we own them, a psychological phenomenon so pervasive that it shapes our decisions about what to keep, what to sell, and what we believe our possessions are actually worth in the marketplace. When you own something, it becomes integrated into your sense of self and identity, and the thought of parting with it activates a sense of loss that feels disproportionately larger than the pleasure you would have experienced if you had never owned it in the first place, creating an asymmetry in how we evaluate the same object depending on whether we possess it or merely desire it. The mechanism operates through loss aversion, that fundamental human tendency to feel the sting of losing something approximately twice as intensely as the satisfaction of gaining something of equal value. And when we own an object, we frame its absence as a loss rather than simply a failure to gain something new. This cognitive framework transforms a simple transaction into an emotional negotiation where our sense of personal loss overwhelms rational calculation, and we find ourselves defending the value of our possessions with an intensity that seems disproportionate to any objective measure of their worth. What makes the endowment effect particularly persistent in human psychology is that it operates almost entirely beneath conscious awareness, influencing our behavior even when we understand intellectually that our valuation is irrational, and we have constructed entire economic and social systems that seem to accept and reinforce this bias as though it were a natural law rather than a quirk of human cognition. We negotiate prices in housing markets, antique shops, and personal sales as though this effect does not exist, and yet it shapes the outcome of nearly every transaction where emotion and personal attachment intersect with commerce. The endowment effect even extends to our relationships with time and experiences. We cling more fiercely to plans we've already made than to opportunities of equal value that we haven't yet committed to, and we resist changes to our routines not because they are objectively worse, but simply because they represent a loss of what we have already incorporated into the fabric of our daily lives. Yet recognizing this effect offers a strange liberation. Once we understand that our attachment to possessions is partly illusory, we gain the ability to question whether we are truly keeping something because it serves us or simply because we have always owned it, creating space for more intentional choices about what we allow to occupy both our physical spaces and our psychological lives. Imagine you have just spent 3 hours assembling a bookshelf from a flat pack, struggling with confusing instructions, wrestling with an Allen wrench, and second-guessing whether that wooden dowel actually fits into that small hole the way you think it does. Your furniture is finally complete, standing somewhat unevenly in your living room, and you step back to admire your work. In that moment, you feel an unusual sense of pride and attachment to this object. You begin to notice its beauty in ways you never would have if someone had simply delivered it pre-assembled to your home. You might even feel reluctant to move it or replace it, despite knowing that a professionally constructed version would be objectively superior in every measurable way. This peculiar emotional connection to something you created through effort is the IKEA effect, a cognitive bias in which we assign disproportionately high value to things we have partially created ourselves. The phenomenon was formally documented by researchers who discovered that people consistently overvalue items they have assembled compared to identical items that were already completed. The mechanism underlying this bias appears to involve the way our brains process effort and investment. When we expend physical or mental energy on something, our brain automatically increases the perceived value of that outcome as a form of justification. It feels illogical to invest hours of your time and energy into something that is not genuinely valuable, so your mind subtly adjusts your assessment of its worth upward to match the effort you have invested. The bias also connects to our fundamental need for meaning and authorship. By constructing something with our own hands, we transform it from a mere commodity into an extension of ourselves, something we can claim partial ownership of in a psychological sense. This ownership effect makes the object feel more important and more worthy of care. What makes this bias particularly persistent is that it operates beneath conscious awareness, masking itself as genuine appreciation rather than distorted judgment. We genuinely feel that our assembled bookshelf is more beautiful than the pre-made alternative, and this feeling is so authentic that we rarely question whether our perception might be skewed by the effort we have invested. The bias has become so normalized in consumer culture that companies have essentially built business models around it, recognizing that customers will pay premium prices for the experience of self-assembly, not despite the inconvenience, but because of it. This insight reveals a deeper truth about human psychology. We do not simply consume value, we create it through our participation. Understanding the IKEA effect in our own lives allows us to recognize when effort is genuinely enhancing an object's worth versus when our emotional investment is clouding our judgment about whether a DIY approach truly serves our interests. Consider the moment you purchase a significant item, perhaps a car or a house, or even a pair of expensive shoes that you have deliberated over for weeks. And then immediately after the transaction is complete, you begin noticing all of the positive attributes of your choice while simultaneously becoming remarkably skilled at dismissing or minimizing any potential drawbacks that were previously troubling you. This phenomenon is choice-supportive bias, a cognitive tendency where we unconsciously inflate the positive qualities of options we have already committed to while downplaying their negative aspects, essentially retrofitting our evaluation of a decision to align with the choice we have already made. The mechanism operates through a combination of cognitive dissonance reduction and the human need for psychological consistency, as our minds work to resolve the uncomfortable tension created when we hold conflicting beliefs or when our actions do not align with our values or initial judgments. When we choose one option, we necessarily reject other options, and this creates an internal inconsistency if we begin to question whether we made the right decision. So the mind smoothly adjusts our perception of the chosen option, emphasizing its virtues and obscuring its faults, while simultaneously exaggerating the negative aspects of the rejected alternatives that we might have selected instead. This bias persists despite having no logical foundation because it serves a powerful psychological function, protecting our self-image and our sense of agency by ensuring that we experience ourselves as competent decision-makers who made sound choices rather than as individuals who might have been mistaken or impulsive or influenced by factors we did not fully control. We have normalized this bias to such an extent that we rarely notice it operating, and instead we attribute our changing perception of our choices to genuine insight or to new information we have discovered, when in reality we are simply engaging in post hoc rationalization, a process so seamless and so thoroughly integrated into how we think that it feels indistinguishable from honest evaluation. The consequences of this bias extend beyond mere self-deception. They can trap us in suboptimal situations because we become increasingly committed to defending our choices rather than objectively reassessing them when circumstances change, meaning that a car we convince ourselves is reliable may continue to accumulate problems we rationalize away, or a career path we have chosen may become misaligned with our evolving values, yet we persist in justifying our original decision rather than honestly confronting whether a different choice might now better serve us. Consider the person who religiously performs the same pre-game ritual before every important event, whether it's wearing the same shirt to job interviews, arranging their desk in a particular way before a presentation, or taking the same route to a meeting they believe will determine their future. They genuinely feel that these actions somehow increase their probability of success, despite the complete absence of any causal mechanism connecting the ritual to the outcome. An athlete bounces a basketball a specific number of times before taking a crucial free throw, convinced that this precise sequence of movements has influenced whether the ball will go through the hoop, even though the physics of the shot depends entirely on the force, angle, and spin imparted during the actual throw. A student insists on studying in the exact same location where they previously earned a high grade, believing that the location itself carries some property that will replicate their academic success. A gambler places bets in a particular pattern or chooses numbers based on personal significance, feeling that their selection method somehow alters the random outcome of machines and draws designed specifically to be unpredictable. The illusion of control emerges from our brain's fundamental need to find patterns and establish causation, to believe that our actions matter in determining outcomes that are either entirely random or dependent on factors far beyond our influence. This bias serves an evolutionary purpose, as creatures who feel some agency over their circumstances tend to be more motivated, more resilient, and more likely to persist through difficulties than those who feel entirely powerless. Yet this same mechanism becomes distorted when we extend it to situations where our control is minimal or non-existent, creating a false sense of efficacy that persists even in the face of contradictory evidence. We have normalized this bias so thoroughly in our culture that we rarely question it, instead celebrating the rituals and routines of successful people without acknowledging that correlation does not imply causation, and that the outcome would likely have been identical had they worn a different shirt or taken a different route. The persistence of this illusion becomes even more pronounced when we achieve success. We retroactively credit our rituals rather than recognizing the role of luck, preparation, or circumstances entirely outside our control, and this selective memory reinforces the false belief, making it progressively harder to distinguish between actions that genuinely influence outcomes and those that merely coincide with them. Over time, this distortion can lead us to overestimate our agency in complex systems, believing we can predict market movements through personal analysis, control our health outcomes through willpower alone, or engineer social situations through specific behaviors, when in reality we are often simply passengers narrating the journey after the fact, constructing coherent stories that flatter our sense of competence and mastery. Imagine you have just submitted an important job application for a position you are genuinely qualified for, one where your background aligns well with the requirements and your interview went smoothly. Yet within hours of sending it, you find yourself mentally preparing for rejection. You begin cataloging reasons why they will not hire you, replaying minor stumbles from the conversation, and convincing yourself that someone else must be more impressive, despite having no actual evidence of this outcome. This tendency to expect negative results even when objective circumstances suggest otherwise is pessimism bias, a cognitive pattern where we systematically underweight positive possibilities and overweight negative ones when predicting future events. The mechanism underlying this bias appears to be rooted in our evolutionary heritage as a species that survived by assuming the worst. Our ancestors who remained alert to danger and prepared for threats were more likely to avoid predation and harm, and thus more likely to pass on their genes, which means that our brains are naturally calibrated toward negative expectation as a survival mechanism. This ancestral programming never fully updated despite the fact that most modern humans now live in environments where catastrophic harm is statistically unlikely, and where positive outcomes occur regularly enough that a more balanced assessment would be more accurate. When we engage in pessimism bias, we are essentially running ancient threat detection software on modern life, treating a job interview or a first date or a health test result with the same level of existential vigilance that once protected us from genuine predators. What makes this bias particularly persistent is that it often feels like wisdom or realism rather than distortion, because we mistake dark expectations for careful preparation or emotional protection. We tell ourselves that by assuming the worst, we are shielding ourselves from disappointment, when in reality we are simply experiencing disappointment twice, once in our imagination during the waiting period and potentially again if the feared outcome comes to pass. The bias reinforces itself through selective memory, as we tend to remember the times our pessimistic predictions aligned with reality more vividly than the numerous occasions when events unfolded better than expected, creating an illusion that our negative forecasting is somehow accurate and justified. Yet breaking free from pessimism bias does not require adopting unfounded optimism. Rather, it involves training ourselves to notice when we are unconsciously weighting negative possibilities more heavily than the evidence warrants, and consciously asking whether our dark predictions reflect actual probability or merely our brain's ancient alarm system misfiring in a safer world. When you catch yourself spiraling into pessimistic predictions, a simple practice is to ask, what evidence would convince me this outcome is actually likely? And what positive outcomes have I underestimated in the past? Questions that gently recalibrate your mental scales toward accuracy rather than alarm. Imagine sitting in a meeting at work where a colleague presents an idea that you find problematic, yet when another person points out nearly identical flaws in your own proposal later that same week, you become defensive and dismissive of their criticism. Or consider the driver who becomes frustrated with other motorists for their reckless behavior on the highway, yet genuinely believes that their own instances of speeding or sudden lane changes are entirely justified by circumstance and necessity. These scenarios exemplify blind spot bias, a cognitive phenomenon wherein individuals fail to recognize their own cognitive biases while readily identifying those same biases in others around them. The mechanism underlying this particular bias operates through a kind of asymmetrical awareness where we have direct access to the specific contextual details of our own situations, our intentions, our pressures, and our reasoning processes, yet we lack this same intimate knowledge of the internal worlds of others. When we observe another person's behavior, we tend to attribute it to their character or disposition, a tendency known as the fundamental attribution error or actor-observer bias, while simultaneously overlooking the situational factors that might explain their actions. However, when we examine our own behavior, we remain acutely aware of the constraints and pressures that influenced our choices, and this awareness naturally leads us to excuse ourselves from judgment. The persistence of blind spot bias despite our capacity for rational thought occurs because most people genuinely believe they are more objective, more self-aware, and less biased than the average person, a phenomenon that becomes increasingly entrenched the more intelligent or educated someone believes themselves to be. We develop elaborate narratives that frame our own contradictions as exceptions rather than patterns, convincing ourselves that we understand the nuanced complexities of our situations in ways that others simply cannot grasp. This creates a troubling paradox. The very mechanisms that allow us to function with psychological resilience, our ability to contextualize our own behavior and extend ourselves grace, simultaneously blind us to how we appear to those around us, making genuine self-improvement extraordinarily difficult without external feedback we're often predisposed to dismiss. The antidote, paradoxically, requires us to actively seek out and genuinely listen to criticism from those closest to us, not to reflexively defend ourselves, but to sit with the discomfort of seeing ourselves through others' eyes, recognizing that their perspective, though incomplete, captures dimensions of our behavior that our internal narratives will forever obscure. When we finally manage this difficult work of receptivity, we often discover that the patterns others see in us were visible all along. We simply lacked the motivation to notice them, protected as we were by the comfortable architecture of our own justifications. This recognition, though humbling, offers the possibility of genuine change, for we cannot correct what we refuse to see. Consider the moment when someone you know has held a conviction about another person, an idea, or even themselves for many years, and then encounters clear evidence that contradicts this long-held belief entirely. Rather than updating their perspective with the new information, they instead find themselves dismissing the evidence, reinterpreting it, or simply continuing onward as though they never saw it at all. This is belief perseverance in its most fundamental form, and it operates quietly in nearly every domain of human thought and experience. A parent might have decided decades ago that their child was not mathematically inclined, and even when that child eventually becomes an engineer, the parent continues to express surprise or skepticism about their abilities, having integrated the new reality into the old narrative rather than abandoning the original belief. An investor who bought into a company's future potential might receive quarterly reports showing declining performance, yet they rationalize each setback as temporary, clinging to their initial conviction rather than reconsidering their analysis. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon is that our beliefs function not merely as isolated propositions, but as integrated frameworks through which we interpret all subsequent information. Once a belief becomes established, it creates what researchers call belief-consistent processing, whereby new evidence is filtered through the lens of what we already believe to be true. When contradictory information arrives, our minds engage in what feels like reasonable skepticism toward the new evidence rather than genuine open-mindedness toward revision. We generate alternative explanations, we question the source's reliability, we focus on exceptions rather than patterns, and we do all of this with such fluency and naturalism that we rarely recognize we are engaged in motivated reasoning at all. The persistence of belief in the face of contradicting evidence suggests something profound about how human cognition actually works, which is not as a perfect instrument for discovering truth, but as a system designed to maintain coherence, protect identity, and reduce the cognitive strain of constantly updating our entire worldview. Yet the strange paradox is that we often feel most confident in our objectivity precisely when we are most deeply engaged in this protective filtering, making belief perseverance one of the most invisible and normalized of all psychological biases. The tragedy is not that we are incapable of changing our minds, but that we have constructed elaborate internal mechanisms to avoid recognizing when we are refusing to do so, making belief perseverance not a failure of intelligence, but rather an unintended consequence of the very mental systems that allow us to function with purpose and direction. Imagine you encounter someone who holds a political belief that contradicts everything you know to be true, so you present them with carefully researched facts, peer-reviewed studies, and logical arguments designed to correct their misconception. And yet rather than reconsidering their position, they become even more entrenched in their original belief, defending it with greater intensity and conviction than before, as if your corrections somehow solidified rather than weakened their stance. This phenomenon is called the Backfire Effect, and it describes the paradoxical situation where exposure to factual information that contradicts someone's existing worldview actually causes them to believe the opposing viewpoint even more strongly. The mechanism underlying this effect operates through several interconnected psychological processes that begin the moment a contradiction is introduced to someone's belief system. When confronted with information that challenges a core belief, the human mind experiences a state of cognitive dissonance, an uncomfortable tension between conflicting ideas that threatens the coherence of one's identity and sense of understanding. Rather than simply accepting the new information and updating their beliefs, people often deploy defensive reasoning strategies, selectively scrutinizing the credibility of the corrective information while simultaneously searching for ways to dismiss or reinterpret it to align with existing beliefs. This defensive process is strengthened by what researchers call identity protective cognition, wherein beliefs become so intertwined with personal identity that attacking the belief feels like a personal attack, triggering not just intellectual resistance but emotional defensiveness that reinforces original convictions. The backfire effect persists as a recognized phenomenon despite ongoing scientific debate about its prevalence and scope, perhaps because it explains something we have all experienced in our social interactions, that nagging intuition that arguing with someone sometimes makes them more wrong, not less wrong, suggesting that the human mind is fundamentally oriented toward protecting its existing narrative structures rather than discovering truth. Yet understanding this tendency need not leave us helpless. Recognizing that belief change requires emotional safety, respect for identity, and incremental rather than confrontational engagement offers a more realistic path toward genuine persuasion than the blunt instrument of fact-checking alone. When we approach disagreement with curiosity about why someone holds their belief rather than immediate correction of what we perceive as error, we create the possibility of dialogue where both parties feel heard rather than attacked, transforming a potential backfire into an opportunity for genuine understanding. Perhaps the most constructive insight is that the backfire effect, rather than being an obstacle to overcome through more aggressive argumentation, reveals an invitation to fundamentally reconsider how we approach disagreement itself, shifting our goal from winning an argument to building the kind of trust that makes genuine belief revision possible. Imagine receiving notification after notification on your phone about a bill you cannot pay, an email from your employer marked urgent that you haven't yet opened, or a medical result you're afraid to check, and instead of facing any of it directly, you simply put your phone down and decide not to look at it for another day, then another week, watching the notifications pile up while you scroll through content that requires no emotional investment whatsoever. This is the ostrich effect in its most pure form, the tendency to avoid information that might be psychologically uncomfortable or financially threatening, as if by not looking at the problem it somehow ceases to exist in the way that matters most to us emotionally. The psychological mechanism underlying this behavior operates through a simple calculus of short-term emotional relief versus long-term consequence, where our brains recognize that the immediate discomfort of confronting bad news or difficult truths is so intense that avoidance seems like a reasonable trade-off, even when every rational part of us understands that ignoring a problem almost always makes it exponentially worse. Our minds become skilled at constructing elaborate justifications for this avoidance, telling ourselves that we will handle it tomorrow when we're in a better headspace, or that perhaps if we wait long enough the situation will somehow resolve itself without our involvement, or that the anxiety of not knowing is somehow less than the anxiety of knowing, a paradox that rarely holds true in reality, yet somehow remains deeply convincing in the moment. What makes the ostrich effect particularly insidious is that we have developed entire cultural and institutional systems that almost reward this behavior, allowing us to ignore mounting debts through multiple payment cycles, permitting us to leave medical screenings undone for years, enabling us to avoid difficult conversations with people we care about until the relationships deteriorate beyond repair. All while society treats this avoidance as a personal failing, rather than acknowledging how the constant noise and overwhelming volume of potential threats makes selective ignorance feel like survival rather than dysfunction. Yet the cruelest aspect of the ostrich effect is that it creates a feedback loop where each instance of avoidance makes the next difficult truth harder to face, until we find ourselves trapped in a labyrinth of our own making, surrounded by unopened letters and unread messages, wondering how we arrived at a place where facing reality feels more terrifying than the consequences of denial itself. The tragedy is that breaking this cycle requires precisely the thing we've trained ourselves to avoid, that initial moment of looking, of opening the letter or reading the email or scheduling the appointment. And understanding this doesn't make it easier, only sadder, because we know that the relief that follows that moment of courage would have been available to us all along if we'd only been brave enough to reach for it sooner. Imagine sitting in a meeting where you and a colleague disagree fundamentally about a business decision, and each of you feels absolutely certain that you are seeing the situation objectively while the other person is being influenced by bias, emotion, or self-interest. You believe you are looking at the facts directly, without distortion, while simultaneously assuming that your colleague's opposing view must be filtered through their own flawed perceptions. This asymmetry in how we judge our own objectivity versus others' subjectivity is the essence of naive realism, a cognitive phenomenon so deeply embedded in human consciousness that we rarely notice it operating. Naive realism is the conviction that we see reality as it truly is, unmediated and unfiltered, while other people who disagree with us must be either uninformed, irrational, or motivated by hidden agendas. The mechanism underlying this bias stems from the simple fact that our own perceptions feel direct and immediate to us. We experience the world through our senses and reasoning, and because this experience happens without our conscious effort or awareness of filtering, we intuitively assume we are accessing objective truth. When others reach different conclusions, we naturally attribute their divergence to some deficiency in their information, their thinking process, or their character. We do not readily consider that our own perspective might be equally shaped by our background, values, and the information we have been exposed to. This bias becomes particularly powerful in domains where genuine uncertainty exists, where reasonable people can interpret the same evidence differently, where moral and political questions involve value judgments that cannot be resolved through facts alone. In politics, we are certain that our policy positions reflect reality while opposing views reflect ideology. In relationships, we are confident that our account of a conflict is accurate while our partner's account is distorted by their emotions. In professional disagreements, we assume our assessment is objective while others are being unreasonable. The persistence of naive realism, despite its logical inconsistency, is striking because it seems irrational to believe that we alone are seeing clearly while everyone who disagrees is blind. Yet the feeling of objectivity is so compelling, so immediate, so resistant to reflection, that we rarely recognize the assumption embedded within it. We have normalized this asymmetry so thoroughly that challenging it feels almost absurd, and people who insist that their perspective is merely one interpretation among many are often perceived as wishy-washy or lacking conviction. Yet the antidote to naive realism is not to abandon conviction entirely, but rather to hold our certainties lightly enough to genuinely consider that intelligent, well-meaning people might interpret the same reality differently. A recognition that transforms disagreement from a battle between truth and delusion into a more humble exploration of genuinely complex questions. Imagine opening a newspaper or scrolling through your social media feed and encountering a steady stream of narratives suggesting that society is deteriorating, that past generations lived better lives, that moral standards have collapsed, and that the world is fundamentally worse than it used to be. You might hear someone say that children today lack discipline compared to previous generations, that crime rates are soaring despite statistical evidence showing they have actually declined, or that the quality of education has plummeted even as graduation rates climb and access to information expands exponentially. This pervasive tendency to view the past through a lens of superiority and to interpret the present moment as a period of decline is known as declinism, and it operates as a subtle but powerful cognitive filter through which we interpret information about our world and ourselves. The psychological mechanism underlying declinism emerges from several converging factors that work together to create a distorted perception of historical trajectory. First, our brains are naturally drawn to negative information, a tendency called negativity bias, which means that bad news captures our attention and lodges itself in our memory far more readily than positive developments. When you read about a crime, you remember it vividly. When you read statistics showing that crime has decreased overall, those numbers feel abstract and fail to create the same emotional impact. Additionally, declinism is reinforced by what psychologists call the availability heuristic, whereby we judge the frequency or likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind, and since negative stories are amplified by media, they become disproportionately available to our consciousness. Beyond this, there exists a nostalgic bias that allows us to unconsciously filter our memories of the past, smoothing away the difficulties, injustices, and hardships that were actually present, and emphasizing the positive aspects through selective recollection. The past becomes romanticized, almost mythologized, not because it was objectively better, but because our memory works like an editor, cutting the scenes we would rather forget. Furthermore, declinism persists because it offers a psychologically comforting narrative. Believing that decline is inevitable absolves us of personal responsibility for creating change, and it allows us to feel superior to those coming after us while experiencing the paradoxical pleasure of lamenting our diminished status. The bias thrives despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, because human progress is often invisible when it is diffuse across society. We do not feel the absence of diseases that no longer kill us. We take for granted the technologies that have eliminated suffering, and we overlook the fundamental improvements in literacy, life expectancy, access to goods, and reduction of extreme poverty that characterize the modern world. Imagine a parent telling their teenager that they are absolutely forbidden from seeing a particular friend, that this friendship is off limits and will not be tolerated under any circumstances. And almost invariably, what happens next is that the teenager becomes even more determined to maintain that friendship, spending more time with that friend, keeping it secret, and viewing the relationship as somehow more important and meaningful than before the restriction was imposed. This is reactance, a psychological phenomenon where people feel compelled to restore a sense of freedom when they believe their autonomy or freedom of choice has been threatened or taken away, and the restriction itself paradoxically becomes a motivator to do precisely what they have been told not to do. The mechanism underlying reactance operates through our fundamental human need to maintain a sense of agency and control over our own lives and decisions. When we perceive that someone or some circumstance is attempting to limit our choices or constrain our behavior, our mind interprets this as a threat to our personal freedom, and we experience an uncomfortable emotional state that creates psychological pressure to reassert our autonomy by doing the very thing that has been forbidden. This response is not typically calculated or conscious. Rather, it emerges automatically from a deep psychological level where our sense of self and independence feels genuinely endangered by external control. What makes reactance particularly persistent despite being fundamentally illogical is that it operates at an emotional level rather than a rational one, and our awareness of the bias does not necessarily diminish its power over our behavior, because the drive to restore perceived freedom is so deeply embedded in human psychology that even when we consciously recognize we are experiencing reactance, we often find ourselves unable or unwilling to override the impulse. Continuing to pursue the forbidden option not because it is truly what we want, but because the act of choosing it becomes a way of asserting that we have not surrendered our autonomy to external forces. This explains why marketing campaigns that use scarcity tactics or limited time offers often backfire with certain audiences. The urgency itself can trigger reactance, making people avoid a product precisely because they feel pressured to buy it, transforming what was meant to be an attractive opportunity into an unwelcome constraint on their freedom of choice. Understanding reactance also helps explain why prohibitive warnings on products, such as graphic images on cigarette packages or alarming health disclaimers, sometimes fail to reduce consumption and may even entrench smokers' behavior, as the perceived threat to their freedom to choose can paradoxically strengthen their commitment to the forbidden behavior rather than weaken it. Imagine a classroom where a teacher receives information that certain students are intellectual bloomers, children who will show remarkable gains in their cognitive abilities over the school year, when in reality, these students were selected entirely at random. By the end of that academic year, these randomly selected students show significantly greater gains in intelligence quotient scores and academic performance compared to their peers, despite having identical starting points and identical actual potential. The teacher's belief about their students' capabilities has somehow shaped the very reality of their development, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy so powerful that it registers in measurable cognitive outcomes. This is the Pygmalion Effect, named after the mythological sculptor who fell in love with his own creation and whose feelings somehow brought the statue to life, a phenomenon where high expectations alone seem to possess the ability to elevate actual performance and achievement. The mechanism underlying this effect operates through a cascade of subtle behavioral and environmental modifications that the expectancy holder implements without conscious awareness. When a person believes another individual possesses greater potential or ability, they unknowingly alter their interactions with that person in consistent ways. They provide more detailed feedback, they ask harder and more thoughtful questions, they create more opportunities for that person to respond and participate, they wait longer for answers before moving on, they smile more frequently, they maintain warmer body language, and they generally allocate more of their attention and emotional energy toward that person. These accumulating micro-interactions reshape the social and learning environment in ways that actually do enhance capability development and performance outcomes. The person holding high expectations inadvertently constructs an ecosystem of advantage around the object of their expectations, and simultaneously, the person receiving these elevated expectations tends to internalize the belief about their own potential, working harder, persisting longer through difficulties, and developing increased self-efficacy and motivation. Both the external environmental modifications and the internal psychological shifts in the expectations recipient conspire to create genuine performance improvements that validate the original expectation, even though that expectation was never based on objective reality. The persistence of this bias exists because we rarely trace our performance outcomes back through the chain of behavioral causality to recognize how subtly our beliefs have shaped the conditions around us. We attribute the improved performance to the person's actual ability when in fact it resulted from a social construction we ourselves engineered. This allows the Pygmalion effect to operate invisibly in schools, workplaces, families, and relationships, where unconscious expectations continuously sculpt the capabilities of those around us, transforming belief into biological and psychological reality through the ancient human mechanism of social influence. Imagine a classroom where a teacher has been told by administrators that certain students in the back row are slow learners, intellectually limited, and unlikely to progress much further in their academic careers. The teacher doesn't consciously treat these students poorly, but something shifts in their behavior in subtle and profound ways. They call on these students less frequently, they wait shorter periods of time for them to answer questions, they provide them with less detailed feedback, and they smile at them less often. Over weeks and months, these students begin to internalize the low expectations reflected back at them through thousands of small interactions. They start to put in less effort, participate less in class discussions, and gradually their actual performance declines to match the expectations that were never truly based on their actual abilities. By the end of the year, the initially false belief has become a self-fulfilling prophecy so complete that test scores and grades appear to validate what everyone assumed all along. The Golem Effect, named after a Jewish folktale about an artificial being brought to life through words, describes precisely this phenomenon where lowered expectations actually cause people to perform worse, as if the negative belief itself has the power to reshape reality. The mechanism operates through subtle behavioral changes in how authority figures or influential people treat others based on their preconceived notions. When we hold low expectations of someone, we communicate this through reduced eye contact, less verbal encouragement, fewer opportunities to speak, shorter wait times for responses, and less detailed explanations. These behavioral shifts accumulate and create an environment where the person receives fewer resources and less social reinforcement for effort and achievement. The person then responds rationally to this diminished feedback loop by reducing their own effort and investment, creating a vicious cycle where the prophecy fulfills itself. What makes this particularly insidious is that it requires no malice, no explicit discrimination, and often no conscious awareness from the person holding the low expectations. The teacher genuinely believes they are treating everyone fairly while unconsciously allocating attention and encouragement unequally. The remarkable thing is that despite our understanding of how this works, the Golem effect persists across schools, workplaces, families, and societies because expectations operate largely outside conscious control. We continue to hold biased assumptions about people based on their appearance, background, or previous performance, and we continue to transmit these expectations through behavior patterns so ingrained they feel natural. The antidote, paradoxically, lies not in ignoring differences, but in consciously cultivating high expectations for everyone while remaining alert to our own behavioral biases. A practice that requires constant vigilance precisely because our minds are so efficient at sorting people into categories and treating them accordingly. Imagine sitting in a dimly lit room with a tarot card reader, astrologer, or even a psychologist who tells you that you have a strong need for other people to like and admire you. Yet you tend to be critical of yourself, and while you present a confident exterior to the world, internally you harbor significant doubts about your own worth and abilities. You listen intently, nodding along, feeling as though this person has somehow peered directly into the depths of your soul and uncovered truths about yourself that you have never shared with another living being. You might leave that encounter convinced that this reader has a special gift or insight, that they truly understand you in a way few others do. Yet the peculiar reality is that the description they provided was so vague, so universally applicable, and so fundamentally human that it could apply with equal accuracy to nearly anyone you might pass on the street. This phenomenon is what psychologists call the Barnum Effect, named after the showman P.T. Barnum, who famously said he had something for everyone. The mechanism operating beneath this experience is remarkably straightforward, yet profoundly powerful. When we receive feedback or information about ourselves that contains statements both specific enough to feel personalized yet vague enough to be universally true, we unconsciously engage in a process of active interpretation and selective attention. Our brains automatically fill in the gaps, connecting generic statements to our own unique experiences, memories, and insecurities in ways that create the illusion of personalized insight. We are primed by the context of the situation, the authority of the person delivering the information, and our own desire to believe that someone understands us, all of which work together to amplify the perceived accuracy of statements that are actually quite unremarkable. What makes the Barnum effect particularly persistent and resistant to our rational awareness is that it satisfies something deep within human psychology. We are storytelling creatures who desperately want our lives and experiences to have meaning and to be understood by others, and when we encounter information that seems to confirm this, we embrace it with remarkable enthusiasm. Even when we intellectually recognize that a horoscope or personality assessment is vague enough to apply to millions of people, there remains a lingering feeling of accuracy, a sense that somehow this particular reading was meant for us specifically, demonstrating how deeply the effect operates below the level of conscious reasoning and deliberation. This susceptibility becomes particularly consequential in contexts where we make decisions based on these illusory insights, choosing careers based on personality tests, making life choices guided by astrological advice, or seeking validation through generic online quizzes, revealing how the Barnum effect extends far beyond mere entertainment into domains where our choices genuinely matter. Imagine you are driving down a familiar highway and you notice that you see a particular model of car, perhaps a blue sedan, 3 times within the span of 10 minutes, and this observation feels remarkably significant to you, as though the universe is sending you some kind of message, or as though this specific car model has suddenly become far more prevalent on the roads than it ever was before. When in reality what you are experiencing is simply the natural randomness of traffic patterns filtered through the lens of your pattern-seeking mind. This is the clustering illusion, a cognitive bias wherein the human brain detects patterns or meaningful clusters in what is actually random or coincidental data, finding signals in noise and seeing intention where only probability exists. The mechanism underlying this bias emerges from the fundamental way our minds evolved to survive in environments where pattern recognition was genuinely adaptive. Our ancestors who could quickly identify patterns in the behavior of predators or the locations of food sources had significantly better chances of survival than those who could not. And so our brains became exquisitely tuned instruments for finding patterns, perhaps even overly tuned, to the point where we now find patterns in genuinely random sequences of events. When you flip a coin and get 5 heads in a row, a part of your mind whispers that something is not quite right, that the coin must be biased, when in truth this exact sequence has exactly the same probability as any other specific sequence of 5 flips. Yet because we intuitively expect randomness to look uniform and scattered, any clustering of similar outcomes feels suspicious and meaningful. This same mechanism explains why lottery players sometimes avoid numbers that have appeared frequently in recent draws, assuming they are now less likely to appear again, when each draw is entirely independent, or why investors often sell stocks during market downturns after witnessing a few consecutive losses, interpreting a natural fluctuation as a signal that the trend will continue downward. When markets contain both random volatility and genuine trends intermingled in ways that are extraordinarily difficult to distinguish in real time. The clustering illusion persists with surprising tenacity because it operates beneath conscious awareness. We are not deliberately choosing to see patterns, but rather our pattern detection systems are firing automatically, generating hypotheses and narratives about what we observe, and these narratives feel compelling and real precisely because they emerge from the deepest levels of our perceptual and cognitive machinery, making them resistant to correction through mere logical argument or statistical education. Imagine a claim that you hear repeatedly over the course of several weeks or months, perhaps something you encounter in conversations with friends, read in articles, or hear mentioned casually in podcasts and videos, and notice how your initial skepticism gradually softens each time you encounter it again. The statement might be something relatively innocuous, like a particular actor being difficult to work with, or a certain food being universally recognized as unhealthy, or a particular historical event having occurred in a slightly different way than you originally understood it. Each exposure to this claim requires less cognitive effort to process than the last, and this fluency, this ease of mental processing, becomes mistaken in your mind for evidence of truth itself. This is the illusory truth effect, and it operates on a remarkably simple but profoundly powerful principle. Repeated exposure to information increases its perceived truthfulness, entirely independent of whether that information is actually accurate or supported by evidence. The mechanism works through what psychologists call processing fluency, which is the subjective experience of how easily information comes to mind and how smoothly your brain processes it. When you encounter something for the first time, your mind works harder to comprehend it, to integrate it with existing knowledge, to evaluate its plausibility. But with each subsequent encounter, the neural pathways involved in processing that information become more established, more efficient, and the information slides into your consciousness with less resistance, less friction. Your brain, in its efficiency, mistakes this ease of processing for familiarity and truth, as if the smooth mental processing itself constitutes evidence of accuracy. What makes this bias particularly insidious is that it operates below the threshold of conscious awareness, bypassing your rational evaluation systems entirely, and it persists even when you explicitly know the source of your familiarity with the information. You might consciously recognize that you have heard something many times, that repetition is the only reason for your exposure to it, yet still feel an intuitive pull toward believing it. The effect emerges because your mind conflates different types of mental ease. The ease of retrieval, the ease of comprehension, and the sense of truthfulness all become tangled together in your subjective experience. We have normalized this bias by constructing entire systems of communication and persuasion around it, from advertising to political messaging to social media algorithms, all of which exploit this fundamental feature of human cognition by ensuring maximum repetition of desired messages, knowing that truth and mere frequency will blur in the minds of audiences over time. The tragedy is that once this effect takes hold, correcting the misinformation becomes exponentially harder, because the repeated exposure to the correction itself can further entrench the false belief, creating a paradox where our attempts to combat illusory truth can paradoxically strengthen it. Imagine walking past a particular advertisement on your commute every single day for weeks, and gradually finding yourself drawn to the product despite having no conscious reason to prefer it over alternatives. Or perhaps you notice that a song you initially disliked has begun to sound pleasant after hearing it repeatedly on the radio, and you find yourself humming along without having made any deliberate decision to change your opinion. This is the mere exposure effect in action, a subtle psychological phenomenon where repeated exposure to a stimulus leads to an increase in liking or preference for that stimulus, even when the exposure is passive and the stimulus itself carries no new information or logical reason to warrant a change in your feelings. The mechanism underlying this effect appears to operate at a foundational level of human psychology, rooted in the principle that familiarity breeds comfort, a tendency that likely served our ancestors well by making them more inclined to trust things and people and places they had encountered before and survived alongside, creating an evolutionary preference for the known over the unknown. When we are exposed to something repeatedly, our brain processes that stimulus more fluently, meaning it requires less cognitive effort to perceive and understand it, and this ease of processing is unconsciously interpreted by our mind as a positive signal, as though the fluency itself becomes confused with liking, a misattribution where the brain mistakes the pleasant sensation of easy recognition for actual preference or quality. The remarkable aspect of this bias is how thoroughly it persists despite our conscious awareness of its existence, and despite the logical understanding that familiarity should not determine quality or worth. Yet we continue to find ourselves developing preferences for logos we see daily, for songs that saturate our media environment, for political candidates whose faces dominate our screens, for brand names that have secured the most shelf space or advertising budget. And we often rationalize these preferences afterward, as though we arrived at them through genuine evaluation rather than through the simple repetition of exposure. This rationalization process itself becomes part of the effect's power, as we construct narratives around our preferences that feel authentic and reasoned, transforming what began as mere familiarity into what we experience as genuine choice. A cognitive sleight of hand that makes the effect particularly difficult to resist or even detect in our own decision-making. Understanding this mechanism becomes particularly important in contexts where our exposure is deliberately engineered, in marketing strategies designed to maximize brand visibility, in political campaigns that rely on repetition rather than substance, in social media algorithms that amplify familiar content. Because recognizing that our preferences may be shaped by exposure frequency rather than genuine merit allows us to create deliberate distance from our automatic reactions and ask ourselves whether we truly prefer something or whether we have simply become comfortable with its presence. Consider the moment when someone gives you a gift, an unexpected favor, or genuine help during a time of difficulty, and notice how that gesture creates an almost invisible weight in your chest, a subtle obligation that pulls at your sense of fairness and balance in the relationship. This is reciprocity bias in its most fundamental form, the deep psychological tendency to feel compelled to return favors, gifts, or kindness in approximately equal measure to what we have received, even when no explicit expectation has been set, and even when the original gesture was entirely voluntary. In retail environments, free samples handed out by cheerful demonstrators create an inexplicable increase in purchasing likelihood among those who accept them, as though the small taste of product has unknowingly enrolled them in an unspoken contract of obligation. In social situations, when a colleague stays late to help you with a difficult project, you suddenly find yourself more willing to volunteer for their tasks in the future, not because you logically calculated that you owed them, but because the reciprocity impulse activated something deeper than rational accounting. The mechanism underlying this bias appears to be rooted in our evolutionary history as social creatures who survived through cooperative group living, where the ability to keep mental track of who helped whom and maintaining a rough balance of exchanges was essential for group cohesion and individual survival. Our brains developed neural pathways that detect generosity and create a sense of debt that motivates us to restore equilibrium, which would have been tremendously valuable in small tribal communities where reputation and reciprocal relationships literally determined whether you would eat or starve. However, modern society has transported this ancient psychological mechanism into contexts where it operates with far less logic and purpose, creating situations where skilled negotiators and marketers deliberately exploit this bias by giving small gifts or favors before asking for much larger commitments or purchases in return, knowing that the reciprocity impulse will often override our rational self-interest. We continue to feel obligated to return calls from people who merely acknowledged our existence, to give substantial gifts to those who gave us modest ones, and to help people whose help to us was circumstantial rather than sincere. Yet we rarely pause to examine why we feel this compulsion when our modern world offers no evolutionary advantage to maintaining such strict reciprocal balances, and indeed, the balance often tips unfairly against us. The insidious elegance of reciprocity bias lies in how it transforms us into willing participants in our own exploitation, making us feel virtuous and fair-minded even as we make decisions that serve others' interests far more than our own. And perhaps most troublingly, the bias operates most powerfully in exactly those moments when we are least equipped to notice it. When we are touched by genuine kindness, and our defenses against manipulation are temporarily lowered by our own capacity for gratitude. Imagine a patient sitting in a doctor's office who mentions a concerning symptom they've researched thoroughly online, presenting legitimate medical literature and detailed notes about their condition. Yet when the doctor dismisses their concerns with a brief wave of the hand and a confident statement that contradicts the evidence, the patient nods and accepts this interpretation without further question, leaving the appointment reassured simply because the person wearing the white coat spoke with certainty. This scenario plays out countless times across hospitals, clinics, and offices worldwide, revealing a fundamental tendency in human psychology called authority bias, which describes our tendency to attribute greater accuracy to the opinions of authority figures and to be more easily influenced by their views, regardless of whether those views are actually supported by evidence or logic. The mechanism underlying this bias operates through several interconnected layers of our cognitive architecture, beginning with the simple observation that throughout our development, from childhood through adulthood, we are frequently rewarded for deferring to those in positions of authority, whether teachers, parents, or institutional leaders, creating neural pathways that associate authority with trustworthiness and competence. Additionally, we unconsciously reason that individuals who have attained positions of authority must possess superior knowledge or judgment, a mental shortcut that feels logical because credentials and titles do sometimes correlate with expertise. Yet this correlation is far from perfect and varies dramatically depending on the domain and the specific situation being addressed. Furthermore, authority figures benefit from what might be called credibility heuristics, meaning our brains process information differently when it comes from someone perceived as having high status, investing less cognitive energy in critically evaluating their claims while simultaneously weighting their statements more heavily in our decision-making processes. What makes authority bias particularly insidious is that it persists even in circumstances where we possess equal or superior information to the authority figure, even when we consciously recognize that expertise in one domain does not necessarily transfer to another, and even when we have explicitly witnessed that authority figure being wrong in the past, suggesting that this bias operates at levels of processing that our conscious reasoning cannot easily override or suppress. Consider the phenomenon of how a renowned economist's prediction about market collapse can influence billions in investment decisions despite lacking a track record of accuracy in forecasting, or how a celebrity endorsement of a medical treatment can override the cautious recommendations of specialized physicians, demonstrating that authority bias does not merely affect individual patient-doctor interactions, but scales up to shape entire markets, policies, and collective behaviors in ways that can have profound consequences for society when that authority happens to be mistaken. Imagine you're watching a film and you see an actor you've always admired playing a character who commits a morally questionable act, yet you find yourself sympathetic to that character's motivations in ways you might not be for a stranger performing the identical action. And this asymmetry in judgment reveals something fundamental about how our minds construct moral narratives around people we perceive positively or negatively. The halo devil effect, sometimes called the halo horns effect, describes our tendency to allow one dominant trait or impression of a person to color our interpretation of their entire character and all of their subsequent actions, creating a kind of cognitive filtering system where positive qualities cast a luminous glow over ambiguities, while negative qualities cast a darkening shadow that obscures potential redemption or explanation. When we encounter someone we've already judged as fundamentally good, we unconsciously interpret their ambiguous behaviors charitably, finding reasons to excuse their mistakes, attributing failures to external circumstances rather than internal character flaws, and readily believing positive information about them while dismissing or minimizing negative information that contradicts our established mental image. Conversely, when we've already categorized someone as bad or untrustworthy, we perform the exact inverse operation, interpreting their ambiguous actions with suspicion, attributing successes to luck or deception rather than genuine capability, and readily accepting negative information while requiring extraordinary evidence to challenge our established judgment. The mechanism operates because our brains are fundamentally lazy prediction machines that seek to conserve cognitive energy by creating stable models of the world. And once we've constructed a coherent narrative about someone's essential nature, we experience cognitive dissonance when confronted with information that contradicts that narrative. So we unconsciously reinterpret or discount the contradictory evidence rather than updating our model. This bias persists in modern life despite our awareness of it because the pattern matching that creates these initial impressions happens largely outside conscious awareness. And even when we recognize we might be biased, we tend to believe we're immune to this particular bias while continuing to succumb to it regularly in our judgments of public figures, colleagues, family members, and strangers we encounter online. The insidious power of the halo devil effect lies in its self-reinforcing nature. Once we've filtered information through our initial judgment, we accumulate a selective evidence base that seems to confirm our original assessment, making it nearly impossible to recognize that our perception has become fundamentally distorted by the very bias we thought we were aware of. Imagine you are shopping for a new television, and you begin by looking at a model priced at $800, which strikes you as expensive and somewhat beyond what you want to spend. So you make a mental note of its specifications and price as your reference point, and then you move to the next display where you see a television priced at $1,200, which suddenly makes the first television seem remarkably affordable and reasonable in comparison. And without any objective change in the quality or features of that first television, your perception of its value has shifted dramatically simply because you have introduced a different price into your evaluation process. This is the contrast effect, a cognitive bias where our judgments of something change based on the context of what we have recently encountered, rather than on the inherent properties of the thing itself. And it operates across nearly every dimension of human experience, from how we evaluate physical attractiveness to how we perceive the quality of a meal or the comfort of a room temperature. The mechanism behind this bias stems from our brain's reliance on relative rather than absolute judgment, which is actually quite efficient from an evolutionary perspective because our ancestors needed to quickly assess whether something was better or worse than what they had known before. Yet in our modern context, where we are exposed to carefully curated comparisons and strategic sequencing, this adaptive mechanism becomes a liability that marketers and persuaders exploit with remarkable consistency. What makes the contrast effect particularly subtle is that we feel as though we are making independent evaluations of each item, when in fact our judgments are being pulled like compass needles toward whatever we encountered most recently. And even when we intellectually understand that a television's quality remains unchanged regardless of what price we saw 5 minutes ago, we find ourselves unable to fully escape the gravitational pull of that contrast, suggesting that this bias operates at a level of cognition that resists our rational efforts to correct it. This is why retailers strategically place their most expensive items first, why salary negotiations often begin with inflated anchors, and why a moderately priced option suddenly feels like an exceptional bargain once we have adjusted our mental baseline. The contrast effect transforms our perception of value not through any change in the thing itself, but through the invisible architecture of comparison that surrounds it. Understanding this vulnerability also reveals why our attempts at objective decision-making often fail us. We cannot simply decide to ignore contrast effects through willpower alone, because the bias operates automatically in the background of our perception, which is precisely why awareness of the technique, while helpful, rarely provides complete protection against its influence on our choices and judgments. Imagine yourself walking into a clothing store where a jacket is displayed with a price tag showing $300 crossed out, with a new price of $99 written beneath it, and immediately you feel a surge of satisfaction, believing you have discovered an exceptional bargain and must purchase the item immediately. Yet the original price of $300 may have existed only in the merchant's imagination or may reflect a price point that has never actually been paid by any customer in the history of the store. This phenomenon is called anchoring and adjustment, and it represents one of the most pervasive forces shaping how we evaluate value, make estimates, and arrive at decisions throughout our daily lives. The mechanism operates through a deceptively simple process in which our minds encounter an initial number, piece of information, or reference point, known as the anchor. And then we use this anchor as a starting position from which we make relatively small adjustments to arrive at our final judgment or decision. When a salesman suggests that a car is worth $50,000, that number becomes lodged in your mind as a reference point. And even when you subsequently discover evidence suggesting the vehicle might be worth only $40,000, you find yourself negotiating somewhere in between rather than reconsidering the entire valuation from scratch. The adjustment we make from the anchor is typically insufficient, meaning we do not move far enough away from that initial number even when logic and evidence suggest we should, because our minds find it cognitively effortful to completely disregard the information we have already encountered and processed. This bias operates with remarkable consistency, regardless of whether the anchor is relevant, arbitrary, or even obviously unreliable. And studies have demonstrated that people's estimates can be dramatically influenced by anchors as trivial as numbers that appear on dice or numbers that people themselves have written down moments before providing their estimates. The persistence of anchoring, despite our intellectual awareness of its mechanisms, reveals something profound about human cognition. We have constructed economic systems, retail environments, and negotiation frameworks that exploit this bias with such sophistication that resisting it requires continuous conscious effort. And most people have simply accepted this dynamic as an ordinary feature of commerce, rather than recognizing it as a systematic distortion of our judgment that operates largely outside our conscious awareness. Yet understanding this mechanism offers a path toward greater autonomy in our decision-making. By consciously pausing to consider whether an anchor is truly relevant to the decision at hand, by seeking out independent information sources before allowing any reference point to take root in our minds, and by deliberately making larger adjustments than our intuition initially suggests, we can begin to reclaim our evaluations from the subtle tyranny of these arbitrary starting points. Imagine you have spent an entire day at a theme park with friends, arriving early in the morning and staying until the evening closes the gates. You experienced long lines, tired feet, overpriced food, and crowded attractions, yet somehow when someone asks you later that week how your day was, you recall it as wonderful and genuinely memorable. The reason for this disconnect between your moment-to-moment experience and your overall memory of the event reveals a fascinating pattern in how your mind constructs narratives about your past. This phenomenon is called the Peekend Rule, and it quietly shapes how you evaluate virtually every experience you accumulate throughout your life. The Peekend Rule describes your tendency to judge an entire experience based predominantly on two specific moments: the most intense point during the experience, whether positive or negative, and how the experience ended. Your mind does not average out all the moments equally. Instead, it gives disproportionate weight to these two anchor points while largely discarding the duration and the cumulative quality of everything that happened in between. In the theme park example, perhaps you had one genuinely thrilling ride near the end of the day when lines were shorter, and the experience concluded with your friends laughing together as you exited the park, and these two moments overshadow the hours of discomfort and frustration. The mechanism operates because your brain is fundamentally a pattern recognition and storytelling machine rather than an objective recorder of experience. When you later recall the day, your mind does not access a complete data file of every minute. Instead, it retrieves emotional snapshots, and the peaks and endpoints serve as the most emotionally salient anchors around which the narrative organizes itself. The peak captures attention because intensity and novelty create strong emotional imprints in memory. The endpoint carries weight because recency bias makes recent information disproportionately influential, and because endings have a narrative finality that your mind treats as representative of the whole story. This explains why a vacation that was mediocre overall might be remembered fondly because it ended with a beautiful sunset, or why a movie with a satisfying conclusion feels better than one with the same content but a weak ending. What makes this bias particularly persistent despite our logical understanding is that we rarely recognize it operating in real time. You experience moments sequentially and forget most of them naturally due to the limitations of working memory. By the time you reflect on the experience, the neural pathways associated with the peaks and the ending have already consolidated into your long-term memory as the most vivid and accessible information. Additionally, this bias served adaptive purposes throughout human evolution. Remembering dangerous or painful peaks warned you about threats, and remembering how situations concluded helped you predict future outcomes. Your brain developed this weighting system because it was efficient and functional, even if it is not perfectly accurate. Consider the way people often describe their childhood, their previous relationships, or jobs they held years ago with a warmth and nostalgia that seems disconnected from what they actually experienced at the time. Someone might speak fondly of a difficult period in their life, glossing over the genuine stress and unhappiness they felt while living through it, focusing instead on isolated pleasant moments or the sense of accomplishment that came later. This tendency, known as Rosy Retrospection, is the human inclination to remember the past as significantly better, more pleasant, or more meaningful than it actually was when we lived through it. The mechanism underlying this bias operates through several interconnected processes that work together to reshape our memories into something more emotionally palatable than the original experience. When we recall past events, we do not retrieve them like files from a perfect archive. Instead, we reconstruct them based on current emotions, values, and narratives we have constructed about our lives. Our brain appears to prioritize emotional resolution over accuracy, meaning that if we have moved past a difficult period, our recollection of it softens, with the rough edges worn smooth by time and the overall emotional tone elevated. Additionally, we tend to remember emotional peaks and endpoints disproportionately, overlooking the tedious or uncomfortable middle sections, which creates a distorted summary of extended experiences. The bias also intertwines with our need for psychological consistency, as we prefer to believe that our past suffering led somewhere meaningful rather than acknowledging the possibility of wasted time or poor decisions. What makes Rosy Retrospection particularly persistent is that it serves a genuine psychological function. It allows us to maintain emotional resilience and optimism despite having endured hardship, to find meaning in struggle, and to preserve our self-image as people who have grown and learned. We have essentially normalized the distortion of our own histories because the alternative, maintaining perfectly accurate and emotionally authentic memories of all our painful moments, would be psychologically exhausting and potentially depressing. This bias quietly shapes our reality by influencing how we assess past decisions, how we approach future situations based on misremembered precedents, and how we construct the narrative of our own lives. When we decide whether to return to a former city, reconnect with an old friend, or pursue a similar career path, we are often acting on these softened memories rather than the reality we actually inhabited, potentially setting ourselves up to recreate disappointments we have conveniently forgotten. In this way, Rosy Retrospection does not merely decorate the past, it actively colonizes our future. Yet paradoxically, this same mechanism that sets us up for disappointment also permits us to take risks we might otherwise avoid. The softened memory of a failed startup or ended relationship makes us willing to try again, to believe that next time might be different, even when the underlying conditions remain largely unchanged. Consider the experience of sitting in a meeting where your colleague presents an idea that you had mentioned to them just 3 days prior, and you feel a sudden surge of frustration and indignation at what you perceive as intellectual theft. Yet when you later present someone else's suggestion as your own insight, you rationalize it as a natural evolution of collaborative thinking, where ideas simply merge and transform through discussion. This is egocentric bias in its most common expression, the unconscious tendency to rely too heavily on your own perspective when interpreting the world and estimating how much others actually care about, remember, or are affected by your actions and thoughts. The mechanism underlying this bias emerges from the simple neurological fact that your own thoughts, feelings, and experiences are perpetually available to your conscious mind with vivid clarity and emotional resonance, while the internal worlds of others remain largely invisible and must be inferred through incomplete external signals. Your brain processes information about yourself with exceptional detail and immediacy because you have direct access to your own mental states, your intentions, your previous conversations, and your current preoccupations, whereas understanding what others know or think requires you to construct theories from limited behavioral observations. This asymmetry creates a profound imbalance in how you weight information, causing you to systematically overestimate how much other people notice your appearance, remember your mistakes, or understand the context behind your actions. You might spend an hour agonizing over a comment you made during a presentation, replaying it endlessly in your mind. Meanwhile, your audience has already forgotten it entirely because they were focused on their own concerns and interpretations rather than cataloging your every word. The persistence of this bias, despite its fundamental illogic, stems from the fact that your egocentric perspective feels like objective reality rather than subjective interpretation, because it is the only viewpoint that feels undeniably real from the inside. Your experience seems like the default setting of existence rather than one limited perspective among billions, and this sense of privileged access to truth makes it remarkably difficult to genuinely internalize that other minds experience the same phenomenon of believing their own reality is the central one. The result is a kind of cognitive loneliness in which you remain trapped in the assumption that your internal experience is more vivid and important than it actually is to others, while simultaneously failing to grant the same interiority and depth to their minds that you so readily grant to your own, creating relationships built partially on mutual misunderstandings that neither party fully recognizes. Imagine you are sitting in traffic on your morning commute when another driver suddenly cuts in front of you without signaling, forcing you to brake hard and creating a dangerous moment. Your immediate thought is that this person is reckless, careless, and inconsiderate, perhaps even someone who does not respect other people on the road. You may think to yourself that they are simply a bad driver, someone whose character is defined by this aggressive behavior. Yet consider an alternative scenario where you yourself accidentally cut off another driver while merging because you were momentarily distracted by your phone or because you simply did not see them in your blind spot. In this case, you would likely attribute your own behavior not to your character, but to the circumstances, recognizing that you are usually a careful driver and that this was merely an unfortunate moment caused by external factors beyond your typical behavior. This is the essence of trait ascription bias, sometimes called the fundamental attribution error or correspondence bias, and it is one of the most pervasive ways in which we systematically misunderstand the people around us while remaining remarkably generous with our own interpretations of our behavior. The mechanism behind this bias operates through an asymmetry in the information available to us and the cognitive pathways we prefer to take when making judgments about others versus ourselves. When we observe someone else's behavior, we tend to attribute it directly to their internal traits, their personality, their character, or their disposition, because these internal factors are psychologically salient and immediately available to our attention. We see the action and we connect it to who we believe that person is. However, when we ourselves engage in the very same behavior, we have access to a wealth of contextual information about our situation, our mental state, our recent experiences, and the pressures we are facing, and so we naturally account for these situational factors when explaining our own conduct. We recognize that we cut off the other driver because we were distracted, not because we are fundamentally a reckless person. We understand that we spoke harshly to a colleague because we were exhausted and stressed, not because we are an unkind person. This fundamental asymmetry means that we chronically overestimate the role of personality and underestimate the role of circumstance when evaluating others, while doing the opposite when evaluating ourselves. What makes this bias particularly resilient and worthy of contemplation is that despite having access to the knowledge that situations matter tremendously in shaping behavior, we continue to make these character-based attributions without much conscious reflection or correction. We know intellectually that people behave differently in different contexts, that stress and fatigue and pressure can change how anyone acts, and that external circumstances can overwhelm even someone with good intentions and generally admirable traits. Imagine sitting in a room during a survey about your daily habits, your spending choices, your exercise routines, or your honest opinions on controversial topics. And as you contemplate each question, you find yourself pausing for just a moment longer than feels natural, because somewhere in the recesses of your mind, you're calculating not what is true about you, but what answer would make you appear as the person you wish to be seen as by the researcher, by your peers, or by the invisible audience of judgment that seems to follow you everywhere. This is social desirability bias, the subtle mechanism by which humans systematically distort their self-reports and their expressed beliefs in the direction of greater social acceptability, answering questions not with authentic truth, but with versions of themselves that conform to perceived social norms and cultural expectations. The mechanism operates through a combination of genuine motivation to maintain a positive self-image and a deeper evolutionary instinct that whispers to us constantly that our standing in the social hierarchy directly determines our survival, our belonging, and our access to resources. So our minds automatically filter our words and our stated beliefs through a lens of acceptability before they ever reach the surface of consciousness or exit our mouths. We claim we exercise more than we actually do, we exaggerate our charitable giving, we downplay our prejudices, we inflate our intelligence or our income, we express more politically correct opinions in public settings than we would in the privacy of our own thoughts, and we present versions of ourselves online that are carefully curated and almost never fully authentic. All because the ancient parts of our brain still believe that honest vulnerability in the presence of others constitutes a genuine threat to our social standing and therefore to our fundamental security. What makes this bias particularly persistent and normalized is that society itself has built elaborate structures that reinforce it, creating environments where dishonesty is expected and authenticity is punished, where job interviews demand false confidence, where social media demands performed perfection, where surveys and questionnaires openly acknowledge their own unreliability. And yet we continue to conduct them as though the distortions they generate somehow represent objective truth about human behavior and human nature, a collective agreement to accept pleasant fictions rather than uncomfortable realities. The irony is that this systematic distortion makes it nearly impossible to truly understand ourselves or each other through the very tools we've designed to facilitate understanding, leaving researchers, policymakers, and individuals perpetually working with data that tells them what people think they should want rather than what they actually want, and thus building systems and making decisions based on a carefully maintained illusion of collective preference that may bear little resemblance to the texture of actual human experience. Picture yourself at a social gathering where you notice a group of people standing together, laughing and talking, and something strikes you as particularly attractive or appealing about them as a collective unit. You find yourself drawn to their energy, their apparent charm, and the way they seem to elevate one another simply by being in proximity. Yet later, when you encounter one of those same individuals standing alone at another moment, perhaps getting coffee or waiting for a bus, you experience a subtle but noticeable shift in how you perceive them, as though some invisible quality has diminished now that they are separated from their group. This phenomenon, formally studied and documented by psychologists, represents what we call the cheerleader effect, a cognitive bias in which our brains systematically rate individual members of a group as more attractive, more competent, or more likable when they appear together than when those exact same people are evaluated in isolation. The mechanism underlying this effect operates through several interconnected psychological pathways that our brains navigate without our conscious awareness. When we observe people in groups, our visual processing system performs what researchers call gestalt processing, meaning we naturally tend to perceive the group as a unified whole rather than as separate component parts. And this holistic perception causes our brain to average out the distinctive features of each individual member, smoothing over imperfections and emphasizing commonalities in a way that creates a more universally appealing composite impression. Additionally, when people gather together, they typically engage in social synchronization, where they mirror each other's body language, adopt similar energy levels, and create a coordinated presentation that feels more polished and refined than what any single person might project in solitude. Our brains interpret this coordination and harmony as evidence of social competence and desirability, and we unconsciously extend that positive valuation to each member of the group. Furthermore, groups generate what psychologists call an exposure effect multiplier, where the presence of multiple people creates more stimulation and engagement, and our brains tend to associate heightened engagement with increased attractiveness and interest, a confusion of arousal with attraction that has deep evolutionary roots. The persistence of this bias in our modern world, despite our increased awareness of cognitive distortions and our general literacy about psychological phenomena, speaks to how deeply embedded these processing shortcuts are within our neural architecture. We have normalized group dynamics as the primary context in which we evaluate people, from social media platforms where individuals are presented alongside others in feeds and group photographs, to professional settings where hiring committees interview candidates in rooms full of observers, to dating scenarios where we first encounter potential partners in group settings before any one-on-one interaction occurs. Imagine a person who donates $50 to a charity on a Tuesday morning, and then later that same week, they find themselves cutting corners at work, being unusually short with a family member, or making a selfish choice in a social situation without the usual guilt they might normally experience. This phenomenon, which researchers call moral licensing, represents a curious disconnect between our ethical intentions and our actual behavior, one that operates almost entirely beneath our conscious awareness until we pause to examine it. The mechanism works something like this. When we perform an action that we perceive as morally good or virtuous, our brain appears to credit us with a moral surplus, a psychological bank account of goodness that we then feel entitled to draw upon later. This moral capital, as some researchers describe it, creates a subtle sense of permission to act in ways that are less aligned with our values, because on some deep level, we feel we have already paid our dues to virtue and therefore deserve a reprieve from constant ethical vigilance. The persistence of this bias reveals something profound about how we construct our moral identities and how we navigate the gap between the people we wish to be and the people we actually are in moment-to-moment life. We have somehow internalized the belief that morality operates like a ledger system, where good deeds offset future transgressions, rather than understanding that ethics are patterns of behavior that require consistent attention and intention. What makes moral licensing particularly insidious is that it often operates without us ever becoming aware of the calculations happening in our minds, and we have collectively normalized this pattern to such a degree that it shapes institutions, charitable systems, and personal relationships without anyone explicitly acknowledging that this is happening at all. A corporation that publicizes a charitable donation while simultaneously lobbying against environmental regulations, or a person who volunteers at a soup kitchen on weekends while exploiting their employees during the week, both exemplify how moral licensing allows us to compartmentalize our ethical lives, treating virtue as something we can perform rather than something we must become. The antidote to this pattern lies not in performing more good deeds to accumulate moral credit, but in recognizing that ethics are not transactional. They are relational and ongoing, requiring us to examine our behavior across all domains of life simultaneously rather than allowing ourselves to feel absolved by isolated acts of virtue. Only when we stop treating morality as something we can balance like a checkbook can we begin to integrate our values into the consistent fabric of who we actually are. This shift requires us to cultivate what might be called ethical consistency, a willingness to hold ourselves accountable not for our best moments, but for our ordinary ones, recognizing that true integrity is built through the accumulation of small, deliberate choices made when no one is watching and no moral credit is being awarded. Imagine you walk into a coffee shop with a crisp $100 bill in your wallet, and you pause before ordering because spending $10 on a latte suddenly feels extravagant and wasteful. Yet if that same $100 bill were broken into 10 $10 bills, you would spend one of those bills without hesitation or a second thought about the transaction. This is the Denomination Effect, a subtle but remarkably consistent bias in how we perceive and spend money based entirely on the form in which we hold it, not its actual value. The phenomenon reveals itself most clearly when we have larger denominations in our possession, whether that is a $50 bill or a $100 bill, because our minds treat these larger units as more valuable and more precious than the equivalent amount distributed across smaller denominations like ones, fives, or tens. When we hold a single large denomination, our psychological relationship with that money becomes fundamentally different, and we begin to perceive it as a more significant and irreplaceable asset that should be preserved rather than spent, whereas the same total amount broken into smaller pieces feels more like everyday spending money that flows naturally out of our hands. The mechanism underlying this bias operates through what psychologists call mental accounting, the way our minds create separate psychological categories for money based on how it is organized and presented to us rather than its actual purchasing power. A $100 bill occupies a more prominent place in our awareness and feels like a larger commitment to part with, even though mathematically it represents the same value as 10 individual $10 bills. And this difference in how we mentally categorize money creates a real and measurable difference in our spending behavior. What makes this bias particularly persistent and normalized is that we have built entire financial systems around denominations without ever questioning whether the denomination form itself influences our choices in ways that are independent of rational economic decision-making. We accept without question that we should have different denominations in our currency, and we rarely stop to consider that this seemingly practical feature of money systems actually manipulates our behavior in subtle ways that often work against our own stated financial goals and intentions. The denomination effect persists because it operates below the level of conscious deliberation, and even when we become aware of it, the bias continues to influence our behavior because our minds automatically process larger denominations as more significant simply through the architecture of how we perceive size, value, and scarcity in the physical world. This is why someone might spend $20 from a stack of singles without guilt, but agonize over breaking a $20 bill, and why retailers strategically use smaller denominations as change to encourage additional purchases. They understand that 5 ones in your pocket feel fundamentally different from a $5 bill, even though both represent identical purchasing power and availability. Imagine you are sitting at your desk on a quiet afternoon, and you notice that a painting on your wall has begun to hang slightly crooked, tilted perhaps 5 degrees to one side in a way that catches your eye every few minutes and quietly bothers you. You look around your room searching for something to help you adjust it, but your mind immediately begins cycling through the same familiar tools: a hammer from the toolbox, a level from the garage, perhaps a measuring tape to ensure precision. Yet there on your desk sits a heavy ceramic mug, half filled with cold coffee from this morning, and beside it a stack of old hardcover books that you have been meaning to donate. Your mind does not reach for these objects, even though any one of them could serve as a perfectly adequate tool to tap the frame back into alignment. This is functional fixedness, the cognitive constraint that prevents you from seeing objects outside of their intended primary purpose, even when those objects could serve alternative functions equally well. The mechanism underlying this bias operates through a process of categorical thinking that occurs so automatically in your mind that you rarely notice it happening. When you encounter an object, your brain rapidly activates associations tied to that object's conventional use, its designed function, the category into which you have learned to place it throughout your entire life. A mug is for drinking, books are for reading, a hammer is for driving nails. These categorical assignments become so deeply embedded in your neural pathways that alternative uses feel almost invisible, as though they simply do not exist as possibilities. Your brain has essentially constructed a perceptual filter that allows you to see objects primarily in their traditional context, and this filter operates beneath your conscious awareness. What makes functional fixedness particularly persistent despite its obvious illogic is that it serves a genuine cognitive purpose in most circumstances. Your brain relies on categorical thinking to reduce the overwhelming complexity of the world into manageable mental models, allowing you to navigate your environment with speed and efficiency rather than questioning the function of every single object you encounter. The bias has become so normalized in human thinking that we rarely acknowledge it as a limitation at all. We design our homes, our workplaces, and our entire material culture around the assumption that objects will be used in their primary designated ways, and this cultural architecture reinforces the cognitive bias with every interaction. Even when you intellectually understand that functional fixedness is limiting your thinking, the bias continues to operate automatically, beneath the level of conscious intention, reminding you that some of the most powerful constraints on human creativity and problem-solving arise not from external limitations, but from the habitual patterns of perception that your own mind has constructed around you. In the 1840s, a Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis made a simple but startling observation in the Vienna General Hospital's maternity ward, where he noticed that the mortality rate from childbed fever was dramatically higher than in other wards, and after careful investigation, he discovered that medical students were moving directly from performing autopsies to delivering babies without washing their hands, thereby transferring cadaverous particles and infectious material from dead bodies to living mothers in the process of childbirth. When Semmelweis implemented a policy requiring hand washing with chlorinated lime solution before attending to patients, the mortality rate plummeted from around 18% to below 2%, a staggering and undeniable improvement that should have revolutionized medical practice overnight. Yet instead of embracing this life-saving discovery, the medical establishment of the time largely rejected it, with prominent physicians refusing to accept that gentlemen of their standing could be carriers of death, and many colleagues subjected Semmelweis to ridicule and professional ostracism for suggesting that their hands were unclean and implicated in patient deaths. The Semmelweis reflex describes this deeply human tendency to reject new evidence or knowledge because it contradicts established norms, deeply held beliefs, or the current understanding of how the world works. And it operates through a psychological mechanism where the mind experiences cognitive dissonance when confronted with information that threatens to upend existing worldviews or professional identities, creating discomfort so profound that people often choose to dismiss or actively attack the source of that threatening information rather than accommodate the new reality it presents. This bias persists with remarkable stubbornness throughout human history and into our present moment, operating silently in scientific communities, corporate structures, political movements, and personal relationships, where people routinely reject evidence about dietary science, climate patterns, medical treatments, economic theories, or social dynamics simply because accepting such evidence would require them to reconstruct their entire conceptual framework and admit to having been wrong for years or decades. And the reflex functions as a psychological self-defense mechanism that prioritizes the preservation of existing identity and worldview over the uncomfortable work of integration and transformation that genuine learning demands. The tragedy of the Semmelweis reflex is that it often operates most powerfully in precisely those moments when intellectual humility and openness matter most, when the stakes are highest and the potential for harm greatest, meaning that our deepest resistance to change frequently emerges not from stupidity or malice, but from the very human need to maintain coherence between our actions, our identities, and our understanding of ourselves as good and competent people. Imagine sitting in a waiting room where a television plays a commercial for a sugary breakfast cereal aimed at children, and you find yourself thinking that while you, as an intelligent adult, are completely unaffected by advertising and marketing messages, the other people around you, particularly those who are less educated or more susceptible, would certainly fall for such obvious manipulation and buy the product based solely on its colorful packaging and celebrity endorsement. All while you remain immune to such influences through the strength of your own critical thinking and superior judgment. This phenomenon, known as the third-person effect, describes our deeply ingrained tendency to believe that persuasive messages and media influences affect other people far more profoundly than they affect ourselves, creating a peculiar psychological distance where we view our own minds as fortified against manipulation, while simultaneously viewing the minds of others as remarkably vulnerable to the very same forces. The mechanism underlying this bias operates through a combination of cognitive mechanisms that work in concert to protect our self-image and maintain our sense of autonomy and rationality. When we encounter persuasive content or potentially biasing information, our minds automatically engage in a form of self-protective reasoning wherein we acknowledge that the message exists and that it might influence someone, but we immediately carve out an exception for ourselves, attributing our immunity to our superior education, our heightened awareness, our critical faculties, or simply our inherent resistance to manipulation in ways that those other people apparently lack. We simultaneously overestimate the impact that such messages have on others while underestimating their impact on ourselves, creating an asymmetrical perception where we become convinced that our beliefs and behaviors stem from our own reasoning and judgment, while other people's beliefs and behaviors stem from external influence and persuasion. What makes this bias particularly persistent and resistant to our awareness is that it operates so seamlessly beneath the surface of our conscious deliberation, allowing us to maintain a flattering self-image as someone who thinks independently and cannot be swayed, while we smugly observe others falling prey to the very advertisements, news stories, and social pressures that have actually shaped our own worldviews far more than we would ever admit. And despite the logical impossibility of everyone simultaneously being less influenced than average, we continue to harbor this comforting illusion about our own imperviousness to the external forces that sculpt human behavior. This blind spot becomes particularly consequential when we apply it to our political beliefs, our consumer choices, and our social attitudes, where we remain utterly convinced that our positions result from careful reasoning while we attribute others' opposing views to propaganda, poor education, or character flaws, never suspending our certainty long enough to entertain the possibility that we ourselves might be similarly deceived by the very narratives we've internalized as truth.